You just say when done, and all.
You are recorders.
I'm totally used to the lights now. So now it's like, it actually makes sense that they're there. Earlier it was like, what are these?
This is the first time teaching with them on? Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I've taught in this classroom at this spot for almost a year now.
Oh.
But
The lights on. Okay. Different room altogether.
all right.
We're gone.
All right. Well, welcome back. You all had a nice lunch. We're about to dive into studying this guy. So probably don't have to tell you that that's a bust of Homer. Who was Homer?
He's blind.
Yeah, what do we know about him?
He's blind.
People say that he was blind. What else do we know about him?
Not much. He actually may not exist.
Yeah, the short answer to what we know about Homer is not much. There's been lots of debate, scholarly debate. You'll know this from other areas already, but scholarly debate about questions like this tend to kind of look like a dog chasing its tail. You know, you have a new idea, everybody jumps on board with that. That goes for a little while, and then you kind of end up right where you started. Starting in the early 19th century, there was a push to think of Homer not as a person, but as a movement, perhaps as a school. Perhaps he was a person, but he was just compiling a lot of other traditions. This dovetailed very nicely with a lot of German scholarship that was taking place at the same time about the Old Testament. If you've taken Old Testament classes, you'll know that there was a push in Germany during the 19th century to identify multiple sources. I'm not an Old Testament scholar, so I won't go into it at length, but in essence, the idea would be that the Old Testament isn't written by, and especially the Pentateuch, isn't written by Moses. In fact, it's all these different sources that perhaps Moses compiled. Well, there was a trend to interpret Homer the same way. Say he's not a literal person. If anything, if he did exist, he was just compiling a bunch of different traditions. Like a lot of German scholarship, that theory was brilliant, innovative, and probably wrong. We're still not sure on the details, but it seems like there is a pretty strong authorial voice in the Iliad, and I think those of you who read at least the assigned sections, but if you read more, you should get a sense that there does seem to be some sort of unifying voice that stands astride this. You would see the same thing if you read the Odyssey that Homer is historically supposed to have written. It seems like someone who has the same kind of concerns as the person who wrote the Iliad. Now I say wrote, and that needs to be taken loosely because the alphabet that he would have been using is probably a different one from the kind of Greek alphabet you would be learning if you take, say, New Testament Greek, ancient Greek. And we're not sure how much of it he would have ever written down. Would he have just been reciting it? It seems likely that this set of events that he tells us about in the Iliad was pretty well known to people in his day. As best we can tell, if he did live, he was probably living around the end of the 8th century. Okay, so we're talking around the year 700 years before Christ, so 700 BC, thereabouts. And it's quite possible that there were traditions for about 400 years about something called a Trojan War that had developed, and he picked up those and compiled them and framed them and put them into this narrative. It's also possible that there were those traditions, but he came up with its own. It's also possible that there were a number of people who would have told these stories, and Homer's the only one we know about. I mean, the options are endless. The problem that sets in when you try to identify the sources of the different stories is the same problem that happens in Old Testament studies, which is everybody has a different rubric for which source is which. Okay, and you're kind of nodding your head, Abe, but I mean, maybe you've seen this in Old Testament.
Yeah,
you know?
you got the Yahwist, and the Elohist.
Yeah. So here you have, let's say, a scholar who says, Homer is actually all about Achilles. And that was one main theory in the 19th century. What Homer was
about
actually...
what?
Achilles.
Achilles.
Okay, the warrior Achilles.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Homeric version of the Iliad that Homer, if he lived, actually wrote would have just been the story of Achilles. And then other bards or poets added to that, and we got this whole collection that now is organized in 24 books known as the Iliad. I mean, the problem with that is it's kind of a non-falsifiable assumption, isn't it? I mean, maybe. But then everything that doesn't talk about Achilles wasn't Homer, because we know that Homer was only worried about Achilles. Well, how do we know that Homer was only worried about Achilles? Because every time Homer speaks, it's about Achilles. But how do you know he was only worried about Achilles? Because he was. You know, it's like you're kind of this dog chasing his tail, right? You can't quite get to the bottom of it. I prefer, in a class like this, to simply reference Homer as if he were a person, and as if he were the at least very dominant voice in putting together this work that has come down to us as the Iliad. Some of this will probably never be fully known, but I think that that's simpler and easier when we talk about this topic, to just think of Homer as a person and as an author. Okay, not an author in the modern sense. He probably didn't sit down in his room and write, you know, once upon a time on a piece of paper, but he is an author, I think, in a very meaningful sense. And I think that's helpful to us as we think about this, because we can at least conventionally talk about Homer. We can say Homer this or that, rather than Homer sub 1 or Homer sub 9 or the Homeric source or whatever. I'd rather just say Homer. Any thoughts or comments about that? It is interesting that a lot of the Homeric scholarship would be taking place at the same time as Old Testament scholarship. There's a lot of overlap. Yeah.
But also, it's also in the 19th century they did it with Jesus as well. You know, you had the different communities and like that. So that was just.
It's rampant, especially in German scholarship. And again, it's often quite brilliant.
Yeah.
So when you look at it, you see that a tremendous amount of work went into this, and a lot of the classicists who were cutting up the Iliad into all these different sources knew a great deal. But then there are a bunch of them that all disagree. And once the 19th century comes along, there's a push away from that in Homeric scholarship. So there are a number of scholars, especially English-speaking scholars, who start pushing away from that and saying, well, hold on, this actually looks like one dominant voice of some kind. And aren't your criteria a bit subjective? You say that the true Homer was all about Achilles, but what if he was actually all about you know, another character? What if it was actually all about Hector or Priam? You know, you can do the same thing, and you can come up with a different result depending on what your criteria are. So there's been a more reasonable pushback, I think, in the last 100 years or so to say, look, our information is limited. Much of what we know about Homer, if he did exist, comes from Herodotus, and that is hundreds of years later. So yes, that's true. But at the same time, if Homer didn't exist, if there wasn't a poet named Homer who wrote the Iliad around the end of the 8th century, then there was probably somebody just like him who may have also been blind who wrote the Iliad. You know, at a certain point, we just have to realize that our information is limited, and let's look at the text. Let's see what the text says as we have it in this form. One of the things that I think is helpful for us as scholars who come from a broad Reformed tradition, and Knox is in a broadly Reformed tradition, is to always be asking the question, what does the text say? That's a great Reformation slogan, isn't it? To the text, ad fontes, back to the text, And in a sense, that's what we're doing. We could spend a lot of time thinking about whether Homer had a wife, whether Homer, had a wonderful childhood or not, but we just won't really ever know. I mean, that's the answer. What we do know is what we have here in front of us. So I'm waffling a little bit on that. I'm not giving you a really, really definitive answer, but that's just because there really isn't a definitive answer. If you want to know more about the history of Homeric scholarship, and in particular the scholarship on whether there really was a Homer, the Robert Fagel's translation includes a wonderful introduction that tells you a little bit more than I have time to go into. So feel free to take a look at that if that's something you're was going to say morbidly interested in. It's something you're interested in. I find it very interesting, but you don't have to. I've put up on the board here, for those of you who want to take notes on this, some of the characteristics of epic that we talked about earlier. This is just to assist you in terms of note-taking, to jot these down. Don't feel like you have to, but I've put this up there. The one thing I'll point out very quickly before we dive into the Iliad is that I put up there one category which we really didn't talk about too much, which is the idea that an epic often includes monsters and dragons. We didn't talk about that much because we didn't really address Beowulf or books like that include those, but we will see that, especially starting tomorrow. So feel free to jot those down if you choose to. We will be coming back to them many times over the next week. So let's take a look at the Iliad. Turn with me to Book 1. And if you have the Fagel's translation, you'll be able to read along very easily. Book 1, it's page 77 in your translation, but the first page of the first book of the Iliad. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion feast for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. This is kind of a brilliant opening passage. It fits one of the characteristics of epic, which is what we said, that it often begins, an epic will often begin with an invocation of the muse. And you see there the phrase, goddess sing. But in Greek, the very first word is rage. That's one of the reasons I asked you to read the Fagel's translation, because he captures that for you. Many other translations will say, sing the muse of the wrath of Achilles, or something like that. Perhaps you read another translation maybe that begins with sing. Why do you think it's important that the first word is rage? A lot of scholars have made a great deal of this. Why is mainen? The Greek word is mainen. Mainen aeda thea peliedio Achilleas. Mainen. Why is it mainen?
I think it's the theme of perhaps the book.
Yeah. I mean, it's the theme of the whole book. The rage of Achilles is the theme of the Iliad. Now, we don't want to be reductionistic. The Iliad is 24 books. It's about 16,000 lines in Greek. There are a lot of themes. But if you had to say, if you were pressed for time, the theme of the Iliad is the rage of Achilles. Why is Achilles filled with rage? I guarantee you there are about 10 right answers, and then there will be plenty others that people have speculated about. I mean, why is Achilles filled with rage?
Because the most obvious one would be Agamemnon stealing his wife.
Yeah. Achilles is filled with rage for a number of reasons. One of them, we will see, is that Achilles feels defrauded. Achilles is full of rage in Book 1 because the man who is the commander of the Greeks, the Achaeans, has stolen his woman. Now, in Greek, the word for the woman that Achilles would have had is something like spear wife or spear woman. Okay, this is not a wife. This is a slave who is taken in war and is a companion of a soldier. Okay, so this is a forced relationship. This is not a equal, mutual, loving relationship. But Achilles is full of rage because Agamemnon has stolen his spear woman named Briseis. Now, why did Agamemnon do that? We've got to back up a little bit. All right, let's talk about the setting of this. And I'm sure you all are familiar with this. You perhaps read a little bit of the introduction, or you've read this before. But what's the setting of all of this? Why is there a war that Achilles is engaged in that he's full of rage about something that happened? I mean, what happened? What's the background to all this? There have been 1,000 ships manned by Greeks that have sailed to the great city of Troy to take the city of Troy. Why? Because one of the sons of the king of Troy is named Priam, one of the sons of Priam named Paris, has stolen another man's wife. He's stolen a woman named Helen. Helen goes down in history as the woman with the face that launched 1,000 ships. Paris was sent as an envoy to Menelaus, one of the Greek kings. He falls in love with Helen and steals her away and takes her back home. I'll be curious what you think about Paris, but I take him to be a bit of a ladies' man and a bit of a pretty boy. The tradition about him is that he often fights with a bow and arrow, so he kills from a distance. He doesn't kill like a warrior up close. But Paris steals Helen and takes her back to Troy. There's endless scholarly debate about exactly what happened. Did he steal her against her will? Many early Greek and Roman scholars, so in the classical period, thought that he did. They thought that she was taken against her will. Others thought, no, she went because she fell in love with him. In any event, he takes her, he brings her to his father's house in Troy, and he hides with her behind the great Trojan walls. This is the great guy here. Now, he's one of 50 sons of Priam. Priam, at this point, is known to many as the happiest man in the world. Why? Because the sign of happiness at this time is wealth, power. He's built a giant city with walls all around it that are impregnable. They think that they're impregnable. And he has 50 sons, 19 of them to one woman. Imagine that. Think of that with 2 sons. That's 25 times the stress and sleeplessness that I go through. But he's proud of his 50 sons, and he's happy. Everything seems to be going well. But one of his sons is a fool. Paris steals another man's wife. Helen comes back to Troy, and there are 1,000 ships launched by the Greeks. Now in Homer, the Greeks are often called the Argives or the Achaeans. You see this? Okay? Don't be thrown off by that. They're often called the Argives or the Achaeans. That's what Homer uses when he talks about the Greeks. Menelaus has a very powerful brother, a man named Agamemnon. Agamemnon assists his brother in raising a giant army and taking this giant army to Troy and besieging Troy. Now, we don't know the size of the Greek army, but it seems like a great number of famous Greeks are included in this army. People like Odysseus. The Roman word for it is, name for him is Ulysses, but Odysseus, the crafty soldier. Many other Greeks are involved in this campaign. And there's 10 years of war outside of the city of Troy. Over and over and over, the Greeks attack the walls and can't take them. Now, there's been a great deal of debate about why the Greeks would have gone to war with Troy. The conventional reading of it, of course, is that Menelaus was offended, that his honor was violated by the theft of his wife, and that he had gone in his own rage to get her back. There's a lot of other readings of it that say that men like Agamemnon, who went on this campaign, did it partly for Menelaus' honor, but partly because Troy was rich. And he gained a lot of honor and wealth by sacking the city of Troy. In any event, they try for 10 years to take the city, and they don't take it. We pick up in book 1 of 24 books of the Iliad at the very end of the war. Now, Aristotle in his Poetics says that only Homer could do something like that. I think it's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, that isn't how you would write a story, I imagine. You would write the story and you'd probably tell the story a bit like I've told it. First there was this, and then there was this. What's the genius, do you think, of picking up a story at the very end like that? I mean, what's so powerful about that? Go ahead.
I think it just builds the curiosity and the drive of the story. I think about like the book or the movie, I think it's called Memento. It's where a guy loses his memory, and it's like it's at the end, and he finds where he is, and then he starts finding out like what happened,
Mm-hmm.
So maybe just it drives tension. It's tension that drives it.
Yeah, I like the word tension. I think that's a helpful contribution to this. There's a lot of tension. We dive in the middle of a lot of tension, right? I mean, the first word is rage. We're going to find out that Achilles is full of rage because he feels like he's had someone stolen from him at the end of this 10 years of war. Homer is telling a story to people probably about 400 years after it happened. Okay, the facts are kind of murky, but if what we think is accurate, which is that there was about 400 years where these stories would have been told, most people would have had a broad sense of the narrative of some kind. Okay? There was a woman named Helen. She was the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris stole her, took her back to Troy. The Greeks came, they besieged the city, and they took the city. How? Well, there was a wooden horse. You guys know this story, right? There was a wooden horse. They filled it with their soldiers, and the Trojans thought it was an offering. They brought it into the city, and in the middle of the night, the Greeks got out and burned the city, took people captive, right? Brought Helen back to her home with Menelaus. So Homer isn't so much concerned about the twists in the story. Like, man, I'm going to give this away. People know this, all right? This would be telling a narrative that's very well known to us, okay? If I wrote a novel or wrote a short story or just told a story and told you this was the night before D-Day, okay? You guys wouldn't be sitting there going, well, no, did the Allies win or did they lose World War II, right? You know the ending. So you're diving in the midst of a great deal of tension. The ending is probably already known. And what the reader or the hearer is delighting in is how you're going to get to that ending they already know. And that's brilliant, isn't it? One moment. Then, on top of it, Homer doesn't tell you the ending. Right? And if you got all the way to the end, you read all the way to the end, he tells you the ending, sort of, but not really. He doesn't tell you about the horse. He doesn't tell you about the fall of Troy. He just tells you that Hector, the breaker of horses, is dead. The end. Now, I mean, only Homer can pull that off. That's what Aristotle says. Please.
I was just going to say, even in contemporary fiction,
Yeah.
the first thing that a publisher looks for is an incident.
Yeah.
A dramatic
Yep.
incident. They call it an intervening
Uh-huh.
incident, which starts off in
Yep.
the middle of the story.
Yep.
And then you go back and you fill in.
Mm-hmm. So Homer, to a great extent, is doing that. But we have to think through this. I mean, when I purchased my copy of this at Barnes and Noble, the person selling it to me said, "Man, they made me read that in high school." And then he said, "I've picked it up recently and I've started reading it again, and it's really good." He's probably middle 50s, maybe late 50s. So he's talking about going back to it 40 years later, having been forced to read it. And what he said is, "I now see why it's been around for 2,700 years." Because there's something to this work that's really powerful. That so much else has fallen by the wayside, but for hundreds of years, through the Dark Ages, copyists are writing down the words of Homer to keep them for us. And so you're right. I mean, he's done certain things in this work that are really gripping, that have allowed it to stick around and continue to have incredible resonance to us. So why is Achilles full of rage? Well, the most obvious reason when we meet him is that he's had something stolen from him. Okay, and I say that somewhat crassly. Okay, because the woman that is stolen from him would have been seen by Achilles as property. Okay, we would not see her that way. We should not see her that way, but Achilles would have, and the Greeks would have. She is a possession taken in war. But what spurs Achilles having his spearwoman Briseis taken away from him? Why is she stolen from him?
She's a trophy.
She's a trophy, and it's because the commander of the Greeks, Agamemnon, has lost his trophy. Okay? There is a woman named Chryseis who was Agamemnon's spearwoman. And Chryseis' father, Chrysis, okay? These names are all rhyming and sounding familiar, aren't they? All right? There's a reason for that. Do you want to know what the reason is?
Yeah.
don't know.
Oh, okay.
No one knows. Okay. Chryseis and Crisis are related because Chryseis probably means daughter of Crisis. Okay, Briseis rhyming with Chryseis is probably because it rhymes. Okay, and it's a nice correspondence. But we don't know. But what has happened is that Agamemnon has had his trophy woman, Chryseis, forcibly taken away from him. Why? Because she is the daughter of a priest of Apollo. And you don't mess with Apollo. Now, this is one of the themes that's going to come up over and over and over in the Iliad, which is that the gods and goddesses are involved on one side or the other. Did you see this? I mean, over and over, a god is intervening. Remember we said it's often called a deus ex machina, a god appearing kind of out of nowhere, intervening. So what has happened in the background here, that we also read a little bit about, is that there has been a plague on the Greek army. They are losing men. Now, to get a sense of the geography here, you have the Greek ships that are probably pulled up to the coast. They're probably pulled out of the water and turned into fortifications of some kind. The Greeks are living in those fortifications for 10 years as they repeatedly go up off the beach towards the city of Troy and try to attack the walls. Now there's plague, perhaps a dysentery or something like that, that's striking down members of the Greek army. And they believe that that plague, and Homer tells us that that plague is because Apollo has been offended, and he is shooting down the Greeks with his arrows. Why? Because Agamemnon refuses to give back his trophy woman, who's the daughter of one of Apollo's priests. Okay? Yeah.
No.
Okay. So, go ahead.
When I was reading this, a lot of what you're saying, like, I don't remember any of that when I read this.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to, but that's why I'm here.
Does it make sense if you kind of knew the narrative that Homer isn't actually always stopping and spelling it out?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
If you kind of knew, see, because it'd be kind of like, well, you know, Dwight Eisenhower was the commander of the Allied armies in the invasion. Let me tell you a little bit. If you knew that that was true, you wouldn't appreciate having that all spelled out to you.
Yeah, I think John does that in his gospel.
Sure.
Compared to the others.
Yeah. He assumes certain things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could you restate what you just said before you...
Yeah. So here's what's happened. The Greeks are fighting. They're stealing women from the countryside. Achilles steals a woman named Briseis, who is his trophy woman, his spear woman. Agamemnon steals a woman, Chryseis. Okay? She happens to be the daughter of a priest. The father comes and begs Agamemnon, give me back my daughter. And Agamemnon, in a rage, sends him away. If you want to see the passage, just turn the page. Let's look at Agamemnon's response to Chryseis, the priest. Page 78, so in the Fagel's translation, a little bit more than halfway down the page, here's Agamemnon's response. Now go, don't tempt my wrath, and you may depart alive. The old man was terrified. He obeyed the order, trailing away in silence down the shore, where the battle lines of breakers crash and drag. And moving off to a safe distance, over and over, the old priest prayed to the son of sleek-haired Leto, Lord Apollo, hear me, Apollo, god of the silver bow, who strides the walls of Chrysa and Kylla sacrosanct, Lord empowered of Tenedos, Smintheus, god of the plague. If I ever roofed a shrine to please your heart, ever burned the long rich bones of bulls and goats on your holy altar, now bring my prayer to pass. Pay the Danaans back. Okay? So that's why you have this plague. It's because Agamemnon has refused to give back this woman. Now, there is just some basic human psychology at play here. Agamemnon is the commander of the Greek army. When the plague happens, a lot of people know why it happened. Achilles is one of them. He's full of rage because he doesn't understand why Agamemnon just doesn't give this woman back. Now, why do you think Agamemnon doesn't? Why does he not give her back? Why does he send the father away? He's the general, he's the top dog, and no one tells him what to do. So when Achilles comes to him and confronts him, they exchange very violent words, okay? The basic human psychology here, Agamemnon is preserving his place as the leader. This is a brutal, warlike culture. See how much of this we can get into in the text, but this is a brutal, warlike culture in which you bludgeon an enemy to death or you die. This isn't a highly sophisticated kind of modern political discourse. You may find some similarities between them, okay? But this is a brutal context. And so what is happening here is Agamemnon is trying not to lose face. When he does decide and is convinced by a number of the Greeks that his keeping Chryseis as a trophy bride, as a trophy woman, is endangering his men, he has to still keep face. So he gives her back to resolve the plague and does what? He steals Achilles' trophy woman. Okay? And just the basic human psychology of this, you have men in a war camp, and Agamemnon is desperate to preserve his honor, to preserve his face. Now, as we said, this results in Achilles being full of rage. He's full of wrath. Another translation says wrath instead of rage. It's a kind of unbridled, boiling under the surface anger. Okay? He has been wronged. How does Achilles respond?
Doesn't he pout?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good, I wish so much of the scholarship just said that. Yeah, he pouts. But when Achilles pouts, there are implications for the war. Why? Because Achilles is the top hero of the Greeks. He is the one who leads them into battle. He's known as a kind of fearless warrior. He has incredible armor, which would probably set him apart. And there's a sense in which Achilles is functioning as the standard bearer of the Greek armies. When you saw his helmet, you would know that's the guy to be behind. Okay? When Achilles pouts, what it means is that he goes back to his ships, and he, and at least some of his men, refuse to fight. Now this means that the Greek cause is going to suffer. Okay? But it's ultimately because he's full of rage, and he feels that he has been dishonored. This is a very, very highly honor-based kind of society, isn't it? Right? You have to preserve face and you have to preserve your honor, and Achilles feels dishonored. So he pouts. He goes back to the encampment, and the fortunes of war turn against the Greeks. Now, let's look at a few other kind of gripping stories, and we'll read a few of them here. What's going on in the meantime is that Paris, the man who kind of got us into this mess, has decided to go into single combat against Menelaus. You guys read this narrative. I mean, how did that strike you? I have my own comments, but how did the Paris-Menelaus single combat strike you? I'll say a few things about it while you're thinking, collecting your thoughts. One is that the story of two armies lined up against each other and then two heroes going out and fighting in single combat is an old one. It's pretty common. You see that in early Roman history as well. We saw it in the story of David and Goliath this morning, didn't we? Where two armies are lined up and then you have the heroes for either side. The fact that the Israelite hero will be a little boy is fascinating, isn't it? But in any event, Paris and Menelaus decide to fight in single combat. How does Paris do?
Yeah.
No.
Anyway.
I mean, not well. You could say a lot of things about it, but it didn't go well for him. I mean, what happens to him?
So, is Paris is with the bow?
Yeah.
Okay, he shoots the other guy's foot?
Yeah. Well, this happens outside of the story, but okay. Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that is part of the narrative, but that's the part of the narrative that Homer's kind of leaving out.
Okay.
Yeah. So in this single combat, we have Paris lined up against Menelaus. Now, Menelaus is a real man. You know, Menelaus knows how to fight. And we'll read just a tiny bit here. So turn to book 3, page 139, and we'll see the description of parts of this battle. I'll also describe it myself a little bit because it gets a little bit too detailed for the time that we have together. But page 139, and laying the victims in the chariot, noble Priam climbed aboard. Do you see that at the top of the page? Laying the victims in the chariot, noble Priam, the king of Troy, climbed aboard, pulling the reins back taut. And Tenor flanked him, mounting the gleaming car. That's a word for chariot. And back they drove again, heading home to Troy. But Priam's son, Prince Hector, and royal Odysseus measured off the ground for single combat first, then dropped 2 stones in a helmet, lots for casting. Who would be first to hurl his brawn-tipped spear? The armies prayed and stretched their hands to the gods. You could hear some Trojan or Achaean pleading, Father Zeus, ruling over all from Ida, God of greatness, glory. Whoever brought this war on both our countries, let him rot and sink to the house of death, but let our pacts of friendship all hold fast. So they prayed as tall Hector, eyes averted under his flashing helmet, shook the 2 lots hard, and Paris's lot leapt out. The troops sat down by rank, each beside his horses, pawing the ground where blazoned war gear lay. And now one warrior harnessed burnished armor on his back, magnificent Paris, fair-haired Helen's consort. First he wrapped his legs with well-made greaves, fastened behind the heels with silver ankle clasps. Next he strapped the breastplate around his chest. His brother Lycaon had fitted him so well. Then over his shoulder Paris slung his sword, the fine bronze blade with its silver-studded hilt. And then the shield strap and his sturdy, massive shield over his powerful head. He set a well-forged helmet, the horsehair crest atop it, tossing, bristling, terror. And last he grasped a spear that matched his grip. Now, I read you that whole description because what Homer is doing there is kind of building the tension, isn't he? He's telling you each piece of armor that Paris is putting on, getting ready for a throttling. It's kind of funny because Paris goes into battle with Menelaus, having spent all of this time preparing and putting on each piece of armor that was specifically designed for him. And Menelaus, to kind of cut the battle narrative a little bit short, strides over and beats the daylights out of him, and then grabs him by the hair on his beautiful horsehair helmet and drags him by it in front of the city. Now, this is not the way a warrior fights, right? He's shamed. And so a goddess feels sad for him. Now, who steps in? What's the deus ex machina here? Who steps in to help poor Paris?
Is it Aphrodite?
Aphrodite. Why does Aphrodite love Paris? Each of the gods has a favorite here. Why does Aphrodite love Paris?
Didn't he choose her as most beautiful?
Yes. Okay, there's a story lurking in the background here called the Judgment of Paris. That years before all this happened, Paris faced 3 goddesses. Hera, Zeus's wife, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And they asked him, which one of us is the most beautiful? And of course, you can imagine each one of them has something to offer. Okay? Say, Athena might offer wisdom, Hera might offer all sorts of power, but Aphrodite offers the most beautiful woman in the world. What do you think Paris goes for? Being Paris? It goes for the most beautiful woman in the world. And then this mess happens. Okay? So as Paris is being dragged by his helmet in front of the city, Aphrodite swoops in and rescues him and drags him up to the city and puts him in the tower next to Helen. Now, this is funny. You're meant to be kind of smirking as you read this because what you want to imagine, okay, is a guy who's like going to go fight for his woman, you know, against the husband that he stole her from. Here he is, you know, carefully putting on all the different pieces of armor, and you know, there's a big description of each one of them. He goes out there and just gets throttled, right? His husband's dragging him along by the horsehair of his helmet. Then he's back up into the tower, and what does he do? He goes, "Hey, baby, you see that?" Like, it's pretty good, right? I mean, like, you know what? Like, who has 2 thumbs, right, and gets dragged by the hair? Like this guy, right? I mean, that's what he's doing. It's funny. You're meant to be kind of enjoying that and laughing in that because it's comical. Aphrodite helps him further because she actually intervenes again and makes Helen think that he's a hero. She kind of causes Helen to unsee what she's just seen. Probably a good chance it'll happen this week. It often happens in a public presentation. Anytime you speak publicly, there's always a chance of messing up very badly. And the worst thing isn't anyone laughing at you. The worst thing isn't anyone like getting up and leaving. The worst thing is the look that's like, I'm actually kind of sad for you. You know, that look where everyone's kind of looking away. Hopefully it doesn't happen this week. there's kind of a sense that the people up on the wall in Troy are feeling that, like, man, this is something you can't really unsee. You know, one of our heroes getting dragged by the helmet hair. But Aphrodite steps in and she helps Helen forget them. Okay, the two of them sleep together and make up, essentially. Now, I mean, what is Homer doing there? Like, what's going on? What do you think? It's enjoyable, isn't it? It's a pleasant read. We could go on and read at more length the description of the battle. If you really like battles, it's a pretty descriptive battle. But what else is going on? I mean,
pride goes before the fall.
yeah.
Just the idea that some person who's very prideful, he's, what's the quote? Let not someone put on their armor as they take it off.
Yeah, as if the one who took it off. Yeah, yeah, it's a quote from the Old Testament, I think.
Yeah,
Right? Yeah.
So it's like this guy's, you know, he's all getting ready. He's kind of prideful. He's ready to make a scene, and you're kind of just glad that this guy gets completely.
Yeah,
you know,
his comeuppance.
Yeah. He gets knocked off, and it's just satisfying for a reader to experience someone be humble.
Now, there are different reads on Paris. I'm giving you my read. You might have a slightly different one, but kind of in carrying forward what you're saying, Sam, I mean, there's a sense here in which the man who got everyone into this trouble is kind of getting his comeuppance, isn't there? I mean, he's showing that he's very good at starting problems, but he's not good at ending them. He can start a fight, but then he can't bring it to a conclusion. And in this world where honor and where virtue is seen as that kind of power, okay, that's a very shaming event, isn't it? I can steal a woman from her husband, but then I run behind the tall walls of my dad and have other people protect me, like the goddess of love.
Wasn't Paris the one that was an expert with the bow and arrow?
Yes, he is.
So he gets caught in a fight.
Yep.
It's like in the Old West, you bring a knife to a gunfight.
Knife to a gunfight. That's
right?
good. Yeah, he's
And
very good at
so-
shooting arrows from a distance, right?
I mean, this is like David in this passage that you read, putting on all that armor.
Yeah.
Well, that's not his game.
It's not his game.
So he had the wisdom to shed the false armor and go back to his game.
His core competency.
And his competency.
Yep.
Whereas Paris apparently is sucked into up the vacuum cleaner and he tries to fight somebody else's game.
Yep, that's exactly right. Who is going to step in and actually take his place? I mean, who has to do the fighting? It's the
Hector, right?
It's going to be Hector. And turn with me. This wasn't a section that I asked you to read, but I think it's going to be helpful for us to look at it together to get a bit of a sense of Hector. We're going to talk a fair bit about Hector this afternoon. Hector is, we might say, the best of Priam's sons. Right? He's got 50 sons. He said one of them is supposedly to one woman. But Hector is the best of Priam's sons. Hector, to a very great extent, as a father of two boys, is what I would want my sons to grow up to be. We're going to see some things about Hector, but Hector is strong and he fights well, but he doesn't fight to fight, if that makes sense. He is put in an untenable situation where his younger brother has stolen another man's wife, has brought her to this city. The Greeks are now at the gates, and if he lets them in, they will destroy everything. If he surrenders, he knows everyone that he loves will be either killed or taken as a slave. So he fights, and he fights well. Now, what is he described as by Homer? This is a good chance to look at this. There are a number of epithets. I mean, how is he described? Let me give you one or two and see if these ring a bell. Hector of the flashing helmet. Does that sound familiar? Horse-breaking Hector, or Hector the breaker of horses. Sometimes called man-killing Hector. All of these are terms that are exalting him. But they're exalting him for bravery, but it's bravery in a context of going to battle not because he wants to, but because he has to. That's my read on Hector. Again, I'm happy to be corrected at any point if you feel like I'm missing something. A note on the epithets. All right, why does Homer use so many epithets? You know what I mean by that? descriptions of a name or place. Okay, the wine dark sea. Okay, I put that in the advertisement for the class. You know, the sea is always wine dark or wine-eyed, wine-faced. Hector, horse taming Hector, horse breaking Hector, gray-eyed Athena, white-armed Hera. I mean, are these ringing a bell? Like they're constant epithets. Thunder-loving Zeus, right?
Yeah.
Zeus of the thunderbolts.
Yeah.
Why? If we solve this, I'm going to steal it and I'm going to publish it. I'm not going to attribute it to any of you. I'm going to publish it as my own, and I will make my entire scholarly career on this. So go ahead.
I heard this in a course that I listened to
Sure.
on my drive here.
Okay, boom, great.
So, because poem was in meter,
Yes.
that they want to end on a certain
Mm-hmm.
note. So if they get ready to the noun and they need a little bit more, they're going to add in an adjective.
Yes.
They're going to add in thunder loving or
Yes.
horse breaking
Yes.
to finish that. I don't know what it's called, but it's that kind of poem.
Yes. This is not a poetry class, so you won't be evaluated on your ability to write poetry or analyze poetry. If you were being evaluated on that, I would first have to be evaluated and I would fail. So that's not the purpose of the class. But Hector writes in something called an epic, Homer writes in something called an epic meter, sometimes called the dactylic hexameter. Okay, main and aida, thea, peliedio, achileos. That's the opening line. It has a certain rhythm to it. It's 6 metric feet. If you don't know what the heck a metric foot is, that's okay. What you need to know is that often in rhyming in that meter or in keeping that meter, there are a certain number of syllables you need. And certain descriptions, sometimes called epithets, are more helpful than others. Okay? Hector, breaker of horses, has more syllables than horse taming Hector, doesn't it? And so depending on what you need for that particular metric line, you're probably going to go with one or the other. Now, Hector may have been known for breaking horses. He probably was. Troy may have been known as a center for horse breeding and horse breaking. There's also significance in the fact that Troy falls to a wooden horse. But you know what? It may also be that you needed horse breaking Hector for that line. Okay? So that's the complexity of something like Homer. All right? It may just be because it helps the metric line. It may be because Hector was all about taming horses. It may be because Troy fell to a wooden horse. Or it may be something else. But that's how we read Homer. There are multiple levels of meaning and explanation to each of these. Did you want to say more?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't say that it's merely a literary device.
Yeah.
That just to say that he used it for the purpose of meter,
Yeah.
that would be like an undermining the feeder. That's not saying that actually didn't happen. It's just saying that that could attribute. So it could be that he actually wants to use that specific.
I'll tell you, you can read the introduction, the Fegel's introduction, if you want to see a bit more about this. And I'll have to go back and look and see what Fegel's has to say about this. But there is also the possibility that Hector or people following him who told this story would improvise a bit. Okay? If you think of something like jazz, as opposed to classical music, there's a great deal of improvisation, is there not, in jazz? There's probably a great deal of improvisation when it comes to the epithets you use. Okay? And, last point, it may help with memory. That's a possibility. Homer has a tendency to talk about the morning in a very descriptive way. Did anybody notice it? When rose-fingered dawn spread her fingers across the sky, rosy-fingered dawn, Dawn rose her rosy fingers, you know, I mean, there's that kind of repetition of rosy-fingered when it comes to dawn as the sun comes up. That kind of repetition of a particular phrase may help the person telling it use that as a line of demarcation, okay? I've got to get from one rosy-fingered dawn to the next. Probably isn't divided into books at this point, so when you memorize it, you need those kind of words or phrases to help you with your memory. There's been all sorts of scholarship on Indian memorization of their sacred text called the Vedas. And there are priests, Brahmins in India that have memorized thousands of lines since childhood. One of the ways that they think they did that is they have lines of demarcation. I'm not memorizing the whole thing. I'm memorizing from this point to that point. And then I pick up there and I memorize to that point, you know? But the repetition of a phrase may help with that, possibly. Much of what I'm telling you is fairly speculative, okay? But that's best we know.
What was that first epithet that you mentioned?
When it comes to Hector,
Yeah, Hector.
he's often called, so he's man-killing Hector, man-killing, he's horse-breaking, or breaker of horses. But then another one that is often used is Hector of the flashing helmet.
Yeah.
Fagel says flashing, which I really like. Others have said shining, but I like flashing. It has a brilliance to it, doesn't it? So let's meet Hector. What's Hector like? We'll look in book 6 together. Turn to page 210 with me. We meet Hector in a really beautiful scene that has been recreated many, many times in art. I'm going to pop up on the screen here for you one of the more famous depictions of it. If this comes up. It's just taking a minute to load. There we go. Do you remember this from the text or from stories about it? You'll know it in a minute. It's Hector bidding adieu, saying goodbye to his wife Andromache and his son Astyanax. Okay? This wasn't an assigned passage, so if you're not remembering that, that's okay. I'm talking about it in the class. You see Hector here, looking very heroic, holding and probably removing his giant horsehair helmet. This is his son Astyanax, and this is his wife Andromache. Okay? We're going to read the passage together, and you'll see why this is significant. This is dated to about 4 centuries before Christ. So well after Homer, but very old. It's on the side of a vase, I believe. I was raised in the South, so I say vase rather than vase. It's being recorded in somebody. Yeah. What's that?
I don't think we say vase
Oh, really?
in the
Okay.
north.
It sounds very
I think
sophisticated.
it's a high life or like high class.
Yeah, I can't pull off high class, sorry. So it's on the side of a vase, but you see here, it's a really brilliant recreation of what we're about to read about. So take a glance back at that as we read this passage. Book 6, starting on page 210, we read that Hector has gone to his wife Andromache to tell her that he's about to go into battle. Now, this is book 6, there are 24 books, okay? But given the shortness of time that's covered, it's shortly before Hector is actually going to die. I hope I'm not spoiling anything for anyone, right? You know he's going to die. He seems to know he's going to die, which is really interesting. And so he goes to say goodbye to his wife Andromache and his son Astyanax. Astyanax is an infant at the time. Now, Andromache has left her family to marry him, as would be common. She had moved to the city of Troy to be his wife, and now she is stuck in a siege. And she says to him at the very top of page 210, about line 508 of book 6, "You, Hector, you are my father now, my noble mother, a brother too, and you are my husband, young and warm and strong. Pity me, please. Take your stand on the rampart here before you orphan your son and make your wife a widow. Draw your armies up where the wild fig tree stands, there where the city lies most open to assault, the walls lower, easily overrun. 3 times they have tried that point, hoping to storm Troy, their best soldiers led by the great and little Ajax, famous Idomeneus, Atreus' son, valiant Diomedes. Perhaps a skilled prophet revealed the spot, on their own fury whips them on to attack, or their own fury whips them on to attack. And tall Hector nodded, his helmet flashing." The common description of Hector, right? The flashing helmet. "All this weighs on my mind too, dear woman, but I would die of shame to face the men of Troy and the Trojan women trailing their long robes if I would shrink from battle now, a coward. Nor does the Spirit urge me on that way. I've learned it all too well, to stand up bravely, always to fight in the front ranks of Trojan soldiers, winning my father great glory, glory for myself. For in my heart and soul I also know this well. The day will come when sacred Troy must die. Priam must die, and all his people with him, Priam who hurls the strong ash spear. Even so, it is less the pain of the Trojans still to come that weighs me down, nor even of Hecuba, that's the name of his mother, of Hecuba herself, or King Priam, his father, or the thought that my own brothers and all their numbers, all their gallant courage may tumble in the dust, crushed by enemies. There is nothing beside your agony when some brazen Argive, a Greek, hails you off in tears, wrenching away your day of light and freedom. Then far off in the land of Argos you must live, laboring at a loom at another woman's beck and call, fetching water at some spring, Nisus or Hyperia resisting it all the way, the rough yoke of necessity at your neck. And a man may say, who sees you streaming tears, there is the wife of Hector, the bravest fighter they could field, those stallion-breaking Trojans, long ago when the men fought for Troy. So he will say, and the fresh grief will swell your heart once more, widowed, robbed of the one man strong enough to fight off your day of slavery. That is beautiful. I mean, that is one of the most famous scenes in all of world literature, right there. I showed you the depiction on the side of a vase. It's been depicted many, many times. And what's going on? I mean, she's telling him, hold back, right? Care for me as your wife. Know that you're everything to me now. I have no one else in the world. You're everything, and you have a son. And he says, I know. I know that that would be the clever thing to do, but it's not the right thing to do. Now, you get his fatalism in this. I mean, it's a very poignant thing that he knows that the city is going to fall. He seems to feel that it's going to fall, and yet he still fights. Why does he still fight?
It's that shame-based culture. You can't live a life of being a coward.
Yeah, it would be the wrong thing to do, wouldn't it?
No.
You fight.
Oh,
Yeah.
and two, well, the way it sounds is like he wants to go down in such a way
Yes.
that people know, hey, there's Hector's wife.
There's Hector's wife. Yep.
Make note of that.
Yep.
He was the man that fought to the very end, and like impart some honor to her,
Yep.
to maybe, help her in her life.
Now let's talk about what's going to happen to her. It's quite brutal. The standard of war at the time, and sadly it's still a standard of war to this day in many places, is that men are killed and women are enslaved. They're often treated horribly in the process. In this case, what he pictures is her at the loom for another man. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say a loom? That word? Okay, it's weaving. A Greek woman, and especially a virtuous woman in Greece, was always seen at her loom. That was the place for the woman in Greek culture. If you read the Odyssey sometime, you'll find that Odysseus' virtuous wife is always at the loom. Now, the funny story about Penelope, Odysseus' wife, is that she tells these men who come for her, who are trying to take her away from her husband, that as soon as she finishes weaving this particular garment, that she'll marry one of them. She weaves it all day, and in the night she unwinds it. So she has to start over every day. Okay? But the virtuous woman in Greece is at the loom. The slave woman of another man is at his loom now. Does that make sense? There's probably some sort of double entendre there as well, meaning what happens to her. She is now in his household, which means that she is another man's property in a very meaningful and degrading way. Okay, so this is a brutal world. One of the things that always strikes me when I read this passage, and I read this years and years ago and cannot for the life of me find who said it, but somebody who commented on this that I read years and years ago made this point, and it's always stuck with me, that Hector seems to be bemoaning the fact that this is happening to his wife, and it will happen to his wife, rather than that it happens in war. Do you see the difference? Okay? It's one thing to say, war should not allow this. Women should be off limits to soldiers. Women should not be enslaved as a matter of course when a city is taken. He doesn't say that. What he seems to be bemoaning is the fact that this will happen to his wife. And this is the kind of thing that is often looked at when scholars debate whether the Iliad is a treatise for or against war. Is Hector here bemoaning that this happens in war, or is he bemoaning that this will happen to someone in his family? Put it more crassly, would Hector do this if he took another city? Okay, and I think the odds are good that he may have. He's seen as a warrior. These are the codes of war at the time. It's possible he would have. We don't know. But it's a question to ask yourself. I'm not here to resolve it for you, but ask yourself, is Hector here bemoaning that this happens, or bemoaning that it will happen to his wife? It's a really interesting question. It's really revealing in terms of how we think about things too. It's one thing to bemoan misfortune when it's happening to you. It's another thing to bemoan that it happens at all. Any thoughts on that? We're going to move on to the next section with Hector here. But it's a really poignant passage, isn't it? It's really gripping, really beautiful. You can kind of see yourself there, can't you? I mean, this is a man going to battle, saying goodbye. So look at the passage as it continues. So just on the following page, he continues, "No, no, let the earth come piling over my dead body before I hear your cries. I hear you dragged away." In the same breath, shining Hector reached down for his son, but the boy recoiled, cringing against his mother's full breast, screaming at the sight of his own father, terrified by the flashing bronze, the horsehair crest, the great ridge of the helmet nodding, bristling tear. So it struck his eyes. I said that the passage we just read was one of the most famous in all of world literature. This might be the most famous. Hector speaking to his son Astyanax and his son recoiling from the horsehair helmet is the passage that every British schoolboy would have memorized in Greek 120 years ago. I mean, this is just one of the key moments in the Iliad. Very, very commonly commented on and is very widely known in terms of world literature. What's so powerful about it? I mean, what's so powerful about just those couple of lines? You know, the soldier about to go to war, who's just talked to his wife, who's bemoaned what may happen to her, who thinks that he's going to die, who now is saying goodbye to his son, but his son is scared of him. I mean, it's very powerful, isn't it? It's powerful at a very basic level because the boy is just scared, right? I mean, there's a helplessness to him. Do you want to say something, Scott?
No.
Okay. The boy is scared. The boy sees probably a giant plume from the helmet, okay, of horsehair that would be very warlike. It's a sign of innocence in some sense. You tell me if I'm overreading it, but the infant who sees an instrument of war and feels fear, it's a helpless image. Now, what's worse is that the tradition here is that Astyanax was killed. Every reader of this knows that Astyanax was thrown off of the wall. So when the city falls, Astyanax's baby is taken from his mother and smashed to death. So when you see this, you see him recoiling in fear, as a reader or a hearer, if you know that that's the end of the story, if you know that that's what the tradition says about this, there's something especially gripping, is there not? Now look here. Screamed out at the sight of his father, terrified by the flashing bronze, the horsehair crest, the great ridge of the helmet nodding, bristling tear, so it struck his eyes. And his loving father laughed, his mother laughed as well, and glorious Hector, quickly lifting the helmet from his head, set it down on the ground, fiery in the sunlight, and raising his son, he kissed him, tossed him in his arms, lifting a prayer to Zeus and the other deathless gods. Zeus, all you immortals, grant this boy my son may be like me, first in glory among the Trojans, strong and brave like me, and rule all Troy in power, and one day let them say, he is a better man than his father. And that's beautiful. If you're a parent, especially a parent of a boy, but a parent of any child, I mean, that's what you want. A father and a son, that's what you want. I read that passage for the first time when I was probably 13 or 14 years old in an unabridged version. And I remember it gripping me, but I also remember thinking, let's get to the battle. You know, like, come on. That's how you think when you're 13. I read it a number of years later after having my first son. We had complications, which resulted in my son actually being in the NICU, the intensive care unit, after he was born. He's fine now, but there were some major complications at the time. You know, and I remember sitting and watching over him, praying over him, and thinking of this passage. You know, that this is what you want for a boy. That one day someone would see him and say, "There's so-and-so's son, but he's better than his dad." You know, I can see the resemblance. You know, but he's better. Those of us who know the kind of things that we've screwed up in our lives, want our kids to do better, whether we have them now or will have them. There is something incredibly homely about this passage. I mean, a father picking up his son and tossing him in the air and talking to him, and yet there is something grand about it too. I mean, this is the goal of every good father for every son ever. And I mentioned this to you earlier, but I would tell you that this entire passage of Hector and Andromache and Astyanax is in many ways Homer at his best. Because there is one level at which you can read this and say, this is a father going to war who says goodbye to his wife and who tosses his son in his arms, full stop. And how many times has that been repeated, right? I mean, how many hundreds of times, thousands of times, millions of times in human history has that been repeated? And yet you could cut that passage out of it and you could study it for decades and you could come up with all sorts of correspondences of wordplay, right? There is something basic about it that grips everyone, and yet there's something complex about it that could allow you to study it over and over and over. Now when I read it, 20 or so years after the first time I read it, I think about what it means to be a father, and I just think, I wish I could get more sleep. All of the poignancy is lost on me. I'm just like, I didn't sleep last night, I want to sleep, But you come to it different each time.
Yeah.
You come back to it. And the goal of a class like this, when we encounter epic literature like this, isn't that I'm sitting here telling you what to think about every single text. It's that you come across a passage like that where you can see this is something to be read a dozen or 2 dozen times, 3 dozen times. Why not? Because each time you'll get something more out of it. That's my hope. Thoughts on Hector and Andromache and Astyanax? It's a brilliant passage, isn't it?
Yeah.
I heard that a lot in this book we deal with mortality.
Yes.
About death, and that's something that we see. It's a human problem that we're dealing with.
Yep.
And then we also have gods on the other hand who are immortal.
Mm-hmm. We
have this mortality and immortal. And then I think about here with this son, and knowing that the son dies, that's almost his channel to live forever, your posterity,
Yep.
whoever goes. So I'm thinking, like most, I think comedies end in a wedding, and that's like, living forever,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how mortals can live out immortality.
Mm-hmm.
This is him not getting to live forever.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think that's interesting that he, you go to war, and maybe the 2 ways you can live forever is what people think of you,
Yeah.
and then also that your sons get to live.
Yes.
But he doesn't get that.
So the passage that comes to mind comes from funeral orations that were given during the Peloponnesian War, a war between different Greek states. And the great Greek orator Pericles gave a speech where he talked about the Athenian war dead. And one of the phrases that he uses that's been picked up on many, many times, you think of somebody like Churchill repeating this. I mean, this is the kind of phrase that Churchill would repeat, is the phrase that in peacetime, sons bury fathers, but in war, fathers bury sons. There's something profoundly wrong about that, right? That the old man sees his son die rather than the other way around. And there's something to that here, that Hector is saying, this isn't right, this isn't the way that things are supposed to be, right? What I want is for me to be long gone, and you're here, and yet there's a sense in which I live on in you, but in a better way. You are me better. And that's what happens in war.
Yeah.
And Homer is, in a sense, grabbing you by the hair and rubbing your nose in it in a really profound way, saying, this is war.
Yeah.
This is it right here.
Yeah.
But is he saying that war is wrong? What do you think, Jim?
The word it keeps coming back to me in this context is ironic.
Yeah.
There's an irony involved. You have, he is functioning on the base, what he's doing it because of his honor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
But the very process of what he's doing, he knows is going to result in his wife's dishonor.
Yeah.
And you have now, then you have, that's the first shoe that falls. Now when you're dealing with his heritage, he's dealing with his son.
Yep.
You have that same kind of mixed framework, it seems to me. I want, how much is irony a factor in the whole Homer scenario?
Let's see. Let's read through the end of this passage and let's find one other, because I think we'll find a really good answer to that here. So let's read to the end of the passage, starting at the bottom of the page. So Hector prayed and placed his son.
Is it still in book 6?
It's still in book 6, bottom of page 211. Okay. So Hector prayed and placed his son in the arms of his loving wife. Andromache pressed the child to her scented breast, smiling through her tears. Her husband noticed, and filled with pity now, Hector stroked her gently, trying to reassure her, repeating her name. Andromache, dear one, why so desperate? Why so much grief for me? No man will hurl me down to death against my fate. And fate, no one alive has ever escaped it, neither brave man nor coward. I tell you, it's born with us the day that we are born. So please go home and tend to your own tasks, the distaff and the loom, and keep the women working hard as well. As for the fighting, men will see to that, all who were born in Troy, but I, most of all. Hector, a flash in arms, took up his horsehair-crested helmet once again, and his loving wife went home, turning, glancing back again and again, and weeping live, warm tears. She quickly reached the sturdy house of Hector, man-killing Hector, and found her women gathered there inside, and stirred them all to a high pitch of mourning. So in his house they raised the dirges for the dead, for Hector, still alive. His people were so convinced that never again would he come home from battle, never escape the Argives' rage and bloody hands. Now there's irony for you, Jim, I think, on that point there, that dirges for the dead, for Hector still alive. There's a discussion in that passage as well of fate. I mean, he's saying to his wife, look at that passage, why so much grief for me? No man will hurl me down to death against my fate. There is a sense on the part of these warriors, Greek and Trojan, that the gods have set things out in a way that you just can't get out of this game, right? I mean, everything is organized in a way that you can't run from your fate. And so for Hector to flee, the idea would be if I fled or I positioned myself at the back of the line, I would die anyway. You know, fate, we say as fate would have it. For the Greeks, there's this very, very powerful sense that we live in a game, the rules of which have been created by people other than us, mostly the gods, right? And we are playing this game by their rules, and we're playing this game in a way that our end is inevitable. You know, the things that happen have been set out and can't be changed. So why do anything? Yeah.
Isn't that a feature of the tragedy?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
When we get to the tragic class, we're having the tragic intensive in June. I hope you all will take that. But the tragic intensive, yeah, it's a lot to dump on you on top of this, right?
Yeah.
But the tragic class will talk about Oedipus, you know?
Yeah.
The fact that there is a prophecy that this child who has been born will kill his father and marry his mother, okay? And everything he does, I don't want to spoil it too much, is designed to avoid doing that. And you know what it drives him to? Doing that very thing, the thing that the oracle said he would do. And there's a sense of inevitability. There's a sense in which it also gives you an explanation for things that are happening. You know, I mean, it gives you an explanatory mechanism for saying this particular thing happened and it was terrible, but this is what the fates would have. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember studying this when I was writing my thesis on it, because
Uh-huh.
it has to deal with free will.
Sure.
And the thing with Oedipus
Yeah.
is that there actually is free will in that story.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just everything's determined. He's trying to run from it.
Yeah.
He has freedom and he's actually choosing things, but the end still happens.
Yeah.
And that's just, that blows
Yeah.
kind of our mind.
Yeah.
The second thing I was going to say, I remember, and I forget who said it when I was doing some research, that there was actually someone, and I think he starts with a P, but he said, hey, if fate's actually going to happen, what is Zeus's thunderbolts going to do to me? So it's this idea that what use is the gods? I mean, they can't contradict fate. So I thought that was very fascinating.
Well, so now's about as good a time as any to talk about the gods. I mean, we're going to see a little bit more with them as well. But I mean, what are the gods in Homer? Like this is a mystery, isn't it? They feel at times like humans on steroids. They are fighting in these battles a number of times. I mean, Aphrodite rescues Paris. Apollo is firing his arrows at the Greek soldiers. I mean, they are engaged in this, and sometimes they're even fighting against each other. So what are the gods like? You know, what do you think? What's your read on the gods here?
Well, they're definitely different than what we think of God.
Yeah, it's a different idea of God. And I mean, there's a long tradition in Greek literature of critiquing Greek gods. I mean, it goes back to Socrates at least. Right? Christians pick up on this. We can talk about this especially towards the end of today when we talk about what we do with this as Christians, but these seem to be fairly petty gods, don't they? They're offended, they're angry, they're wrathful. Yeah.
They almost seem like, what was one of the features is the characters represent virtues and vices.
Yeah.
They do that to an extreme.
Right,
Like
right.
Zeus, Zeus in particular, he's loud as a character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And he will start to step in and then be dissuaded from stepping in. He gets angry. He's, like you say, he's kind of loud. He's aggressive. Yeah.
They just seem very fickle.
Yeah.
It can just be, and part of it's just they can help move the story in different directions. So it kind of, in writing, it just kind of feels like, hey, I need an out of part of the story, so let's get crazy, throw a god in there, let them do whatever they want, and they can just instantly change the course of the narrative through the use of these gods.
When an author nowadays wants to just change the narrative in a quick way that's kind of sloppy, people in reviewing it will often describe it as a deus ex machina, right? Like the author has positioned himself or herself as a god in the text and has decided, we're going to take the story in a different direction, you know? The Odyssey, which you haven't read, comes to a brilliant ending where Odysseus has come home, he's slaughtered all these men who were vying for the attention of his wife, and then he and his son Telemachus face this vast army of relatives who are trying to kill him. But Athena loves Odysseus, so she swoops down and the story comes to an end. You're just like, just as we're getting ready for some of the best stuff in the narrative, it's just over. So the gods seem to have this tendency to just interject themselves at interesting times and take the narrative in a different direction than we were expecting. I mean, the gods for Homer are every bit as real as his other characters. I mean, do you get that sense? I mean, they are characters in this play. They don't have different titles. You know, they are still characters in this play. Do you want to say something different?
Was it too much of a stretch to make reference to the Apostle Paul in Romans 7, where he does the thing that he doesn't want to do, and he doesn't do the things that he wants to do, and yet his problem, I mean not a problem, his resolution is that he's not stuck with the Greek God and the fate of the Greek gods, but he has a
I've never thought of that passage in particular. I mean, the kind of passages I think about when it comes to Paul, or Paul on, St. Mars Hill, for instance, critiquing the gods. That's an interesting one. I have to go back and look at that. That's an interesting point.
Because that solves the problem. In other words, the good God, or the real God, the true God, is not locked into that humanistic pro and con that might be interpreted as a fate thing, or it might be interpreted as almost beyond my control.
Beyond my control, and then therefore, to some extent, beyond my responsibility too. Yeah.
And yet he, the true God, is not caught into that enigma, shall we say.
Yeah, early Christian apologists, think of Justin Martyr and people like that, are constantly hammering on this point, that your gods just look really human. We'll need to come back to this by the end of the class today, because I'd love to think through that with you in terms of what Christianity offers in terms of its vision of God that would be different from this kind of vision. Let's skip forward a bit. We've got a lot still to cover if we're going to finish this for today. One of the things that Hector does after he leaves his wife and his son is he turns the tide of the battle to a great extent back in favor of the Trojans. He sallies forth from the city, and there is book after book after book about him and his soldiers driving the Greeks back to their ships. Okay? Now, in this process, we meet a man named Patroclus. Now, who is Patroclus? What is his role in this? We're throwing out names here. It's not a pop quiz. Don't worry.
He's like Achilles' like best friend.
Best friend. They are described as loving each other like brothers. The analog is often David and Jonathan. The descriptions are very similar. The two love each other very much. Achilles has decided that he will not fight for the Greeks, but he permits his best friend, Patroclus, his brother, if you will, Patroclus, to fight, and actually gives Patroclus his armor. I mean, in a war, this kind of thing, in an ancient war, this is really significant. He's giving him his armor. Patroclus straps on the armor, goes into battle, and gets killed. He gets killed by Hector and Hector's men. And Hector does something that's often overlooked. Readers of the Iliad will often overlook this. He strips Patroclus of Achilles' armor, and Hector puts on Achilles' armor. Now, this is just a fascinating image, because who's going to kill Hector? Achilles. And when he kills Hector, Achilles is going to kill a man wearing his armor, a man who looks like himself. I won't travel down that path as far as I could go, but you can imagine that a lot of interpreters have seen a lot in that. But Achilles, in a sense, is almost killing himself when he does that. When Patroclus dies, Achilles is full of rage, because he's Achilles, right? That's what he does. You know, if you got Achilles' business card, it would say Achilles, full of rage. You know, he's full of rage. And now he's full of rage at the Trojans to an extent that he will actually overlook the slight on his pride of taking away his spearwoman, and he will rejoin the ranks. He will come back and fight for the Greeks, not because he's had anything returned to him, not because there have been any inducements, but simply because he is so full of rage at the death of Patroclus. Achilles slaughters Trojans. There's book after book, and you saw this. I mean, one of the titles in the Fagles translation that's wonderful is Achilles fights the river. There's a scene with Achilles standing in a river killing Trojans. Achilles is out of his mind. This is probably a phenomenon that could have happened. I mean, the Vikings, for instance, had a man at the front of the line who was called a berserker. That's where we get the term berserk, going berserk. And he would get some sort of bloodlust to the point where he would literally not be himself. He would go so crazy with an axe or a sword or what have you. And there's a sense in which this is Achilles. He's so full of rage. His rage has possessed him so much that he is at the front of the Greek lines again, and he's driving back the Trojans. The only hope for the Trojans rests in Hector, in a single combat between Achilles and Hector. I think we've gone enough to probably take a break at that point. Take maybe a 5-minute break, kind of use the bathroom, get some coffee, and I'm going to connect with the person who's appearing remotely, Kathy, and we'll put her on Zoom for the final part of our class discussion. When we pick up, we'll be at book 22 on the death of Hector. Let's come back at about 5 after. Does that work for everyone? So about 7 minutes. I'll take a quick bathroom break and coffee break. Cool. introduce yourself as well, and if you ask us questions, Kathy, I'll probably repeat them, just because there's a camera over that way. So if I repeat them, it's not that I'm stupid and trying to work through them. I'm repeating them for the camera. All right?
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So I'll mute you right now, but then I'll unmute you when we come to the Q&A. Does that work?
That's fine.
Just out of energy, you know how that is?
Probably muted on your end too, if that's okay, so we don't pick up any feedback. Good?
You were reading that passage about saying goodbye to the sun. I was about to say something, I can't. Like, it's just.
Oh, it's gripping, isn't
I
it?
haven't slept well in the past couple of
Yeah.
days, 2 weeks. I don't.
Well,
I don't know how you feel.
you're a father, so.
Yeah, I'm a son. He's 7 months old. It's just. It's incredible.
Can you, Kathy, can you mute it on your end?
Yes.
Thanks.
Actually, yeah, I think that'll work better because if
Yeah, there's a delay.
She has headphones, that'll help out.
Sorry?
If she puts in headphones, that'll actually help out with
Oh, yeah, okay.
Well, of course,
I
if
think
she's
she's
listening on the Zoom and listening on this, there's a delay from when the live stream goes out, she sees the live
So it's
stream.
probably, isn't it better, it would be better than if this is muted on my end too, right?
For this.
For right now,
Yeah, for
okay.
right now, for the lecture, yes.
Okay. Homer's great, isn't he?
I was gonna ask, is there like another one theme I see is like revenge?
Oh yeah,
Cause like
the Achilles and
I mean with
others.
Moby Dick it's like a huge thing.
Yeah.
With Song of Roland, like the whole last battle is just both of them trying to get each other.
So you're saying a broader theme of revenge in terms of epic, not just the,
Yeah.
the Iliad. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you can see that in a number of epics. I mean, the Song of Roland is one. Beowulf, depending on how you read it, might also have that kind of theme. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. It's kind of part of that warlike culture too. A lot of it can be seen in the parking lot. I mean, a dispute over a parking space between two guys where neither of them wants to lose face, you know, and you've got to yell just enough to make sure that the other person knows that you keep your honor, you know, that kind of thing. Like, you give those people armies and weapons, and you've got carnage that's going to ensue.
Yeah, and like, the Aeneid also starts off with the shooting of the deer?
Mm-hmm. There is a shooting of deer, yeah.
Sounds like road rage.
Road rage.
Shooting people
Yep.
over being cut off in traffic or something.
The, like South Florida thing, you know? We lived in Edinburgh for 3 years, and it has so many problems, of course, like any place, but that kind of thing just doesn't happen. So as soon as we move back, you start reading some of these stories, you know, someone cuts someone else off, and then they pull a gun and shoot him or something, and it's like, well, you're down in Dade.
Dade City.
Okay, all right, so that's not...
About 40 minutes north of Tampa.
Gotcha.
So it's not Miami-Dade County. It is a small 6,000 population city.
I never made that connection, because I always heard, I just heard the Dade part of it,
Yeah.
and I was like, okay, like Miami.
Small town,
Yeah.
bunch of antiques.
Huh. Have you been down there, Doug? You know it?
Mhm.
Yeah. Oh,
That's old Florida.
old Florida.
Yeah.
This is new Florida.
What's the Robert Was Here place? Do you know that? Down there, pretty far south of Miami, but it's still on this coast. It's a big like farmers market. I think it's called Robert Was Here. My wife and I went down there. Really rural. Like, it was surprising to us because we assume as you go south it gets more
Yeah.
developed. But
No, I'm north of Tampa.
oh, okay. I thought you were saying like over.
No,
I see.
I'm north of Tampa.
Got it. Got it. That
40
gives me a totally different sense of
Yeah,
where you
sorry,
live.
45
Nope.
minutes north of Tampa.
That's because when I was practicing, I was down in Miami a lot. So when I think of Miami-Dade, I think of the courthouse down there.
Yeah, I don't know why we're called Dade City versus people get that confused a lot.
Yeah. Well, I guess we should get going. We're still waiting on Scott, but we'll give him a minute, but probably should dive into this pretty soon. Take a minute, if you would, and turn to book 22, which is where we're going to pick up with the death of Hector. we said when we talked about these characteristics of epic, and we'll talk about them through the class, but we said that one of the things is that it's about foundings and falls. And the fall of Hector, in many ways, is the fall of the city of Troy. The death of Hector is the death of his city, for reasons I think we've seen. I mean, he is the person who can stand up to the Greek armies, and he seems brave enough to actually lead his men courageously. So here is Hector in book 22. About 16 books before, he said goodbye to his wife and his son. Now he is going to his death. And so let's read, and we'll have to sadly skip through some of this. We won't read all of it, just because we'll be pressed for time if we do. But look with me at page 542, and we'll see Priam watching Hector going to battle. It's a really beautiful scene in Homer here. Hi there, sorry. No worries. Middle of the page, 542, line 31 in book 22. And old King Priam was first to see him coming, surging over the plain, blazing like the star that rears at harvest, flaming up in its brilliance, far outshining the countless stars in the night sky, that star they call Orion's dog, brightest of all, but a fatal sign blazoned on the heavens. It brings such killing fever down on wretched men. So the bronze flared on his chest as on he raced, and the old man moaned, flinging both hands high, beating his head and groaning deep he called, begging his dear son, who stood before the gates, unshakable, furious to fight Achilles to the death. We're going to see what he cries out, but there's something here that I think is worth paying attention to. It's something that, as you read through the Iliad, you saw dozens and dozens of. It's a simile, okay, a like. Homer is known for that. They're epic similes. Did you see a bunch of these? You know what I'm talking about, Abe?
Yeah.
Blazing like the star that rears at harvest, flaming up in its brilliance, far outshining the countless stars of the night sky, that star they call Orion's dog, brightest of all, but a fatal sign emblazoned on the heavens. What did Hector look like? Like that. Okay, that's the idea. Turn the page, and I'll show you another simile real quick. That's a kind of fun one, and we'll go back to Priam. But if you turn the page, line 111. We see that Hector, it says, waited Achilles coming on gigantic in power. As a snake in the hills, guarding his hole, awaits a man, bloated with poison, deadly hatred seething inside him, glances flashing fire as he coils round his lair. So Hector, nursing his quenchless fury, gave no ground. Okay? As a snake in a hole. That is a simile. Why do you use a simile? If you're Homer, why do you use similes? Okay. Yeah.
I think similes help create abstract ideas with concrete examples that just kind of like grip you.
Yeah. He could. So Homer, if he were less of a bard, might have said Hector waited for Achilles, ready to attack. Okay? You think, okay, well that looks like millions of things I've seen. But a snake in a hole, I mean, it grips you, doesn't it? And that is often the purpose behind a simile. Homer is known for his similes. He's known for what seems to be meandering at times into similes. Like, and I've taught Homer in many, many different contexts. Occasionally I'll have someone say, well, why doesn't he just get to the point? Just tell us the guy was waiting there. I don't want to hear about the snake. But the majority of people, especially people with an imagination, really love that. And what you have to think is that the person who's hearing this is reveling in that simile. How was Hector waiting? Oh, that's how. Right? It was like a snake in a hole. Okay, so back to Priam, about line 45 on page 542. Here's what Hector says. Here's what Priam says about Hector. He says, "Oh, Hector, don't just stand there. Don't, dear child, waiting that man's attack, alone, cut off from friends. You'll meet your doom at once, beaten down by Achilles, so much stronger than you, that hard, headlong man. Oh, if only the gods loved him as much as I do. Dogs and vultures would eat his fallen corpse at once, with what a load of misery lifted from my spirit. That man who robbed me of many sons, brave boys, cutting them down or selling them off as slaves, shipped to islands half the world away. Okay? There's something poignant in his appeal to Hector, speaking to him as dear child. Okay, this is a man in armor getting ready to go into single combat. But child harkens back to Hector speaking to his son, doesn't it? I mentioned before that there was a lot of debate among interpreters as to whether Priam was really the happiest man who ever lived because he had 50 sons. One of the things that we find in Priam that might make him, in fact, the unhappiest man who ever lived is having 50 sons. He got to watch them each die. You think of the king at the end of, I want to say it's First Kings. He's taken into captivity. To look up that reference. But he has his sons killed in front of him, right? And then he's blinded. In that, Zechariah, right? No. Is it Zechariah or Zedekiah?
Zedekiah, that's it.
You get the idea. I mean, a man who was once happy, who had many things, and in particular many sons to bring him honor, is most unhappy when he sees them killed. And that's what he's speaking of here, is watching the best of his sons going into battle. Turn to the next page, 543, still Priam speaking. Pity me too, still in my senses true, but a harrowed, broken man marked out by doom, past the threshold of old age. And Father Zeus will waste me with a hideous fate. And after I've lived to look on so much horror, my sons laid low, my daughters dragged away, and the treasure chambers looted. Helpless babies hurled to the earth in the red barbarity of war. My sons' wives hauled off by the Argives' bloody hands. And I last of all, the dogs before my doors, will eat me raw. Once some enemy brings me down with his sharp bronze sword or spits me with a spear, wrenching the life out of my body. Yes, the very dogs I bred in my own halls to share my table, guard my gates, mad, rabble at heart, rabid at heart, they'll lap their master's blood and loll before my doors. For a young man, all looks fine and noble if he goes down in war, hacked to pieces under a slashing bronze blade. He lies there dead. But whatever death lays bare, all wounds are marks of glory. When an old man's killed and the dogs go at the gray head and the gray beard and mutilate the genitals, that is the cruelest sight in all our wretched lives. So the old man groaned and seized his gray hair, tore it out by the roots, but he could not shake the fixed resolve of Hector. I think that bears just leaving on its own. I won't even comment on it. That's war. Hector goes into battle, and as he knew would happen, he is slain by Achilles. And he's slain by Achilles in part because there's intervention. Athena helps Achilles. All right? It's always good to have a goddess on your side, especially if it's Achilles, or if it's Athena. And she appears to aid Hector by appearing as one of Hector's brothers, and then aids Achilles, and Hector is slain. Now, just as Hector is about to be slain, he speaks to Achilles. And look with me at page 552, right before line 400. We're going to see what Hector says. Now, this, I will submit to you before we read it, would have appalled an early hearer. Okay? Someone who is sitting and listening to the bard recite this would be cringing. You ever watch a documentary on World War II? There were certain things that took place during that period, in particular the Holocaust. Things that are good to know about, but I personally, when I get to them, I have to turn away. I can't bear it. It's so awful. This would read or sound like this to one of Homer's audience. Okay? Struggling for breath, the bottom of the page, struggling for breath, Hector, his helmet flashing, said, I beg you by your life, your parents, don't let the dogs devour me by the Argive ships. Wait, take the princely ransom of bronze and gold, the gift my father and noble mother will give you, but give my body to friends to carry home again, so Trojan men and Trojan women can do me honor with fitting rites of fire once I'm dead. Staring grimly, the proud runner Achilles answered, beg no more, you fawning dog, begging me by my parents. Would to God my rage, my fury would drive me now to hack your flesh away and eat you raw. Such agonies you have caused me. Ransom? No man alive could keep the dog packs off you, not if they haul in 10, 20 times that ransom and pile it here before me and promise fortunes more. No, not even if Dardan Priam should offer to weigh out your bulk in gold. Not even then will your noble mother lay you on your deathbed, mourn the son she bore. The dogs and birds will rend you blood and bone. At the point of death, Hector, his helmet flashing, said, I know you well, I see my fate before me. Never a chance that I could win you over. Iron inside your chest, that heart of yours. But now beware, or my curse will draw God's wrath upon your head, that day when Paris and Lord Apollo, for all your fighting heart, destroy you at the Scaean gates. Death cut him short. The end closed in around him. Flying free of his limbs, his soul went winging down to the house of death, wailing his fate, leaving his manhood far behind, his young and supple strength. But brilliant Achilles taunted Hector's body, dead as he was. Die, die, for my own death, I'll meet it freely, whenever Zeus and the other deadless gods would like to bring it on. It's brutal. The early listener pulls away in revulsion. This is a travesty of holocaustic proportions. To desecrate the body of an opponent, especially a noble opponent, is the ultimate travesty. It's not a travesty to kill him. And you notice that Hector doesn't ask for his life to be spared. He asks not to have his body desecrated. Why? Why does the Greek listener shudder at Achilles' rage? Why?
At the end of page 552, it says, so the Trojan men and Trojan women give me honor.
Yeah.
What's the
There is
honor?
an honor and a fitting burial.
Yeah.
Okay? All sorts of ideas about what the Greeks may have believed about the underworld. It seems to be a pretty dark and gloomy place. But to be dishonored in a death where you are hacked to pieces and not able to be fittingly buried with the proper funeral rites is a tremendous dishonor to you, and it's a tremendous dishonor to your family. It's a tremendous dishonor to your memory. We will see other cases of this down the road in other classes where this is a very, very big issue for an ancient person. Turn the page, we see what they did. Standing over him so they'd gloat and stab his body, but once he had stripped the corpse, the proud runner Achilles took his stand in the midst of all the Argive troops and urged them on with a flight of winged orders. Friends, Lord of the Argives, O my captains, now that the gods have let me kill this man who caused us agonies, loss on crushing loss, more than the rest of all their men combined, come, let us ring their walls in armor, test them, see what recourse the Trojans may still have in mind. Will they abandon the city heights with this man fallen, or brace for a last dying stand, though Hector's gone? But wait, what am I saying? Why this deep debate? Down by the ships a body lies unwept, unburied, Patroclus. I will never forget him, not as long as I'm still among the living, and my springing knees will lift and drive me on. Though the dead forget their dead in the house of death, I will remember, even there, my dear companion. Now come, you sons of Achaia, raise a song of triumph. Down to the ships we march and bear this corpse on high. We have won ourselves great glory. We have brought magnificent Hector down, that man the Trojans, glorified in their city like a god. So he triumphed, and now he was bent on outrage, on shaming noble Hector, piercing the tendons, ankle to heel behind both feet. He knotted straps of rawhide through them both, lashed them to his chariot, left the head to drag, and mounting the car, that means chariot, hoisting the famous arms abroad, he whipped his team to a run, and breakneck on they flew, holding nothing back. And a thick cloud of dust rose up from the man they dragged, his dark hair swirling around that head so handsome once, all tumbled low in the dust, since Zeus had given him over to his enemies now, to be defiled in the land of his own fathers. It goes on, but it is a vivid depiction of the desecration of a body. And as he's dragging him back to the ships, it's as if the Trojans on the walls who have seen this happen are now watching their hope vanish. He's going back to the ships to do what he refuses to permit Hector's family to do, to give Patroclus an honorable burial. He is going to bury his friend Patroclus and have games for him, have celebrations of his life. And we read in several of these passages that when he gets especially rage-filled and wrathful about the death of Patroclus, that he goes out and further desecrates the body of Hector. That he will ride with him, dragging behind the chariot around Patroclus's funeral pyre. This is a man who's full of rage. a man who is going against even the minimal limitations on war that existed in his time. I mean, we've seen how much could take place in war and be okay for the Greeks. The enslavement of women, the killing of children in a siege, that is okay. What you can't do is desecrate the body of an opponent, especially a noble opponent, and this is what Achilles is doing. But that's not the ending. How does it end? We'll come to an end here with the final and one of the most famous scenes in the Iliad. It ends when an old man goes into the camp and begs Achilles for the body of his son. It ends when Priam goes to Achilles' tent in the middle of the night and does something. And I'll read you the passage. It's a brilliant and remarkable passage. It's incredible that these words would come from the mouth of Priam, the man who had 50 sons, who was seen as the happiest man in the world. On page 605, Priam says to Achilles, he says, "I have endured what no one on earth has ever done before. I put to my lips the hands of the man who killed my son." Here's what Priam does. He goes to Achilles' tent. He knows that Achilles is wrathful. Remember earlier, Hector's appeal to Achilles was that Achilles think of his own parents, right? Think of your own parents. And Achilles throws that back at Hector. But Priam goes to say the same kind of thing. But he does it physically to show Achilles what it looks like to have an old man beg for the body of his son. And so we find on page 604, the end of book 24, Priam's plea to Achilles to give him back the body of his son Hector. Top of the page on 604, Priam, who's been assisted by Hermes in kind of getting into Achilles' tent, finds Achilles, and we find at the top of the page, about line 550 or thereabouts in book 24. Priam found the warrior there inside, many captains sitting some way off, but two. Veteran Automedon and the fine fighter Alcimus were busy serving him. He had just finished dinner, eating, drinking, and the table stood near. The majestic king of Troy slipped past the rest and, kneeling down beside Achilles, clasped his hands and kissed his hands, those terrible, man-killing hands that had slaughtered Priam's many sons in battle. Awesome is when the grip of madness seizes one who murders a man in his own fatherland and flees abroad to foreign shores to a wealthy, noble host, and a sense of marvel runs through all who see him. So Achilles marveled. Now, I'm going to go on. That's a brilliant simile, isn't it? As when the grip of madness seizes one who murders a man in his own fatherland and flees abroad to foreign shores to a wealthy, noble host, and a sense of marvel runs through all who see him, so Achilles marveled. Why does he marvel? He marvels beholding majestic Priam. His men marveled too, trading startled glances. But Priam prayed his heart out to Achilles. "Remember your own father, great godlike Achilles, as old as I am, past the threshold of deadly old age. No doubt the countrymen round about him plague him now, with no one there to defend him, beat away disaster. No one, but at least he hears you're still alive, and his old heart rejoices, hopes rising day by day, to see his beloved son come sailing home from Troy. But I, dear God, my life so cursed by fate, I fathered hero sons in the wide realm of Troy, and now not a single one is left, I tell you. 50 sons I had when the sons of Achaea came, 19 born to me from a single mother's womb, and the rest by other women in the palace. Many, most of them violent Ares, cut the knees from under, but one was left me to guard my walls, my people. The one you killed the other day, defending his fatherland, my Hector. It's all for him I've come to the ships now, to win him back from you. I bring a priceless ransom. Revere the god, Achilles. Revere the gods, Achilles. Pity me in my own right. Remember your own father. I deserve more pity. I have endured what no man on earth has ever done before. I put to my lips the hands of the man who killed my son." Those words stirred within Achilles a deep desire to grieve for his own father. Taking the old man's hand, he gently moved him back, and overpowered by memory, both men gave way to grief. Priam wept freely for man-killing Hector, throbbing, crouching before Achilles' feet as Achilles wept himself, now for his father, now for Patroclus once again, and their sobbing rose and fell throughout the house. Then, when brilliant Achilles had had his fill of tears and the longing for it had left his mind and body, he rose from his seat, raised the old man by the hand, and filled with pity now for his gray head and gray beard, he spoke out winged words, flying straight to the heart. Poor man, how much you have borne, pain to break the spirit, what daring brought you down to the ships all alone to face the glance of the man who killed your sons, so many fine brave boys. You have a heart of iron. Come, please, sit down on this chair here. Let us put our griefs to rest in our own hearts. Rake them up no more, raw as we are with mourning. What good's to be won from tears that chill the spirit? So the immortals spun our lives that we wretched men, live on to bear such torments. The gods live free of sorrows. There are 2 great jars that stand on the floor of Zeus's halls and hold his gifts. Our miseries one, the other blessings. When Zeus, who loves the lightning, mixes gifts for a man, now he meets with misfortune, now good times in turn. When Zeus dispenses gifts from the jar of sorrows only, he makes a man an outcast. Brutal, ravenous hunger drives him from the face of the shining earth, stalking far and wide, cursed by gods and men. So with my father, Peleus, what glittering gifts the gods rained down from the day he was born. He excelled all men in wealth and pride of place. He lorded the Myrmidons. Immortal that he was, they gave the man an immortal goddess for a wife. Yes, but even on him the father piled hardships. No powerful race of princes born in his royal halls. Only a single son he fathered, doomed at birth, cut off in the spring of life. And I give the man no care as he grows old, since I sit here in Troy, far from my fatherland, a grief to you, a grief to all your children. And you too, old man, we hear you prospered once, as far as Lesbos, Maker's kingdom, bound to seaward, Phrygia, east and upland, the Hellespont, vast and north, that entire realm, they say, you lorded over once. You excelled all men, old king, in sons and wealth. But then the gods of heaven brought this agony on you, seekless battles round your walls, your armies slaughtered. You must bear up now. Enough of endless tears, the pain that breaks the spirit. Grief for your son will do no good at all. You will never bring him back to life. Sooner you must suffer something worse. There it is. I mean, that's epic. Right? It's one of the most famous passages in Homer. Like I mentioned with the other one, it'd be the one that every boy learning is Greek in a British private school would be memorizing and learning to decline and conjugate. It's a beautiful image of an old man begging for the body of his son and essentially playing the card that I'm an old man like your father to win over this rage-filled Achilles. It's fascinating how the rage almost seeps out of Achilles. It's almost like a balloon that's blown up that just gets popped by that appeal. Think of your own father, an old man like me. It's a powerful model, by the way, in persuasion. If you need to persuade someone like Achilles, chances are good going over and telling him he's a terrible person wouldn't have helped. Priam would have been killed too. He appeals to Achilles' honor. He says, remember your father and think of him, an old man like me. So Achilles' wrath relents. He comforts Priam. He gives Priam back his son. And Priam takes Hector back into the city to bury Hector with full honor. And we'll read together the closing lines of the Iliad on page 614. At last, when young dawn with her rose-red fingers shone once more, the people massed around illustrious Hector's pyre, and once they'd gathered, crowding the meeting grounds, they first put out the fires with glistening wine, wherever the flames still burned in all their fury. Then they collected the white bones of Hector, all his brothers, his friends in arms, mourning, and warm tears came streaming down their cheeks. They placed the bones they found in the golden chest, shrouding them round and round in soft purple cloths. They quickly lowered the chest in a deep hollow grave, and over it piled a cope of huge stones closely set. Then hastily heaped a barrow, posted lookouts all around, for fear the Achaean combat troops would launch their attack before the time agreed. And once they'd heaped the mound, they turned back home to Troy, and gathering once again, they shared a splendid funeral feast in Hector's honor, held in the house of Priam, king by the will of Zeus. And so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. That's it. So that's the Iliad. We've talked about it, but Homer plays his cards well, doesn't he? He doesn't tell you that the city is going to fall by a wooden Trojan horse, but you know the city's going to fall, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, that final line tells you that it's going to happen. What are your thoughts? We have close to an hour that I've tried to preserve for some question and answer. I'll unmute Kathy here in a moment, and we can hear from her a little bit. But before we go over to Kathy, let me just ask you. I mean, reactions to the Iliad. I mean, what do you think? Yeah.
I think there's, I don't know if there's the right word for it, but there's this horrifying beauty to the whole thing, where you don't know whether to be, that was awesome, or like, that makes me sick, you know?
Yep. You should feel both, I think.
Yeah, it is. The son, saying goodbye, and then you've got him coming to his, or the part where he's dragging his body around, and then you've got that moment there where he kisses him. It's just, both of those are just hitting you really hard.
You should write a book on Homer and say that, because that's something I think a lot of people have felt.
Yeah.
I mean, the takeaway from many readers of Homer, especially the Iliad, is that there's an awful beauty to it.
Yeah.
There is a kind of horrifying beauty at times. It's a bit too crass to compare it to this, but it's a bit like driving past a horrific accident of some kind and the need to look. There's a sense that you have that. There's also just a tremendous grandeur and beauty to the narrative, is it not? I mean, he's telling you about these vast battles and these men at arms.
Yeah, I don't know if I could say this just yet, but it does remind you of the cross when you think of the sacrifice and the gruesomeness of it, where you don't know whether to be horrified or say, it's beautiful, but it is both.
And you would also not be the first person to compare Christ and Hector. I mean, that's a comparison that's been made plenty of times. There's a kind of attention-grabbing grandeur to that kind of gesture, is there not? To someone who goes out and fights for his city, he fights for his family, he fights for his son. He knows he's going to die, but he knows that if he doesn't, somebody else will have to do it. I mean, there's just something really gripping about that. The British love this. I mean, this is I told you about the King of Bohemia, who they honor for riding blindly into the English arrows. I mean, there's something to that sense that here is a man doing his duty. If you go to Trafalgar Square in London, you'll see that there's a monument to Admiral Lord Nelson, who led the British fleet in a number of naval battles against Napoleon. And right before the Battle of Trafalgar, one of the great victories over the French Navy, Lord Nelson is supposed to have cabled the entire British fleet. England expects this day that every man will do his duty. I mean, that's Homer, There's just a grand sense of duty and honor that you see in that. That's been inculcated through classical modes of education in generations of people who have grown up reading these things. Thank you for that. That's excellent. Yep.
I think it also personalizes war. I think most of us, won't end up ever going to war.
Right.
We're going to battle, but we can almost say we've experienced the loss and the grief of what war does to a family as if it was our own.
Yep.
So the way he draws you into the story and understanding like the loss of Priam and all 50 of his sons, it feels like that could be our loss by the way it was written. We feel that personally.
Yeah. A person dying in battle can feel like a statistic, can't it? Where when you meet them, you get to know them in Homer. When Hector dies, it's not another warrior died during the Trojan War. It's Hector died during the Trojan War. And I think as humans, but also as Christians, there is a need to hone our ability to empathize with people like that. It's one thing to turn on the news and hear, okay, there was a bombing in this city, or there was this battle that was just fought, and this many people died, and this many people were captured, and whatever. But to actually realize these are people who are actually suffering in real life is a really important thing, not just for reading the news and hearing about wars and battles, but also in our dealings with other people who are unlike us or in different contexts. I think Homer does that. He takes you and forces you to see this is what it looks like, you know. Yeah.
He does that a bunch of times too, where before someone dies, he kind of goes in a history. He, like their characters, I don't even remember, really, because there's a bunch of them.
Yeah.
And he'll kind of relate, like, oh, he was born here and his dad did this, and well, you haven't met him, but now he's dead.
Yeah.
So he's trying to personalize a little bit, and I think, like, well, I guess story in a sense does that. Like, you have to bring the big picture into one single character to see how that big picture is affecting the world around, you know, by focusing on a single, you know, character and hero.
Yeah. And, you know, those of you who communicate for a living will know this, but one of the skills that Homer is just a master at is the power of specificity. You know, I mean, this is something I learned as a trial attorney, but you learn this as any kind of public communicator, that if you say that, you know, Fred lost his hand, and now Fred is seeking money from that big corporation, okay? The jury isn't very likely to award any money. But if you say Fred lost his right hand, the one that he wrote love letters to his wife with, the one that he used to earn his money to pay for his family to live, that hand, Fred lost his right hand. You know, now all of a sudden Fred's hand that was lost isn't just a hand, it's a hand that did things. Does that make sense? I mean, that's a crass example, but you know that from practicing law too, Jim. I mean, often, you know, if you are going to appeal to someone's emotions in any way, one of the ways to do that is through specificity. Sometimes you appeal to their emotions to get them to laugh that way. Comedy is often best when it's very specific. I think we saw in that passage where, you know, Paris is getting dragged by the horsehair on his helmet. I mean, it'd be one thing to say he went to battle with Menelaus, the husband of the woman he's with, and lost. It's another thing to think of him kind of rattling around on the ground, being dragged by this much more warlike person. I mean, it pulls you in. So I think that's just a really brilliant point, that there's so much specificity and ornateness to this. I mean, we skipped over massive amounts of the Iliad. You have to go back and read it yourself over and over. There are countless things. You're gonna email me in a month and say, I just reread it, and why didn't you talk about book 7? I'll just say we didn't have enough time. but there are countless things that you can look at. Do you want to say something, Jim?
I was just going to say that I think, for me, I guess, perhaps the most profound thing about the epic is that in the final analysis, there is purpose, as opposed to the so-called postmodern mentality of the fatalism, where there's no purpose. And I think it's interesting that even in those kind of situations where they seem to, all the way along, preach futility, in the final analysis, they have to figure out some purpose.
Yeah, at the end of the day.
Reason. And so they are, in effect, adopting back the old scenario.
Yeah. At the end of the day, you're either going to go fight or you're not. And there is a brilliant immediacy to the Iliad. I think in the midst of all of the ornate descriptions, and I showed you some of the similes, there are hundreds more that we didn't discuss, it kind of rushes at you like a soldier with a spear. I mean, it says dodge quickly, because it starts with rage and it starts with a fight, and it just pulls you in very quickly. And you feel drawn in because these characters have to act. Put the philosophy to the side. They have to act. There's something that has to be done here. I'm going to unmute Kathy at this point, and why don't you, Kathy, if you are happy to do this, why don't you introduce yourself to us, and then also comments and questions and thoughts on all this. We would love to hear them. So I'll go ahead and unmute you at this point. We can't all see you, but go ahead. There's actually no one there. I've just made this up. No, go ahead, Kathy.
I always forget that unmute thing, sorry.
No worries at all. So go ahead and introduce
I turned
yourself.
off my sound on the other thing, so hopefully you hear me okay.
We can hear you great. So go ahead and introduce yourself, and then
Okay.
we'll hear some things from you.
My name is Kathy Weitz, and I'm very excited to be here. This is, I don't even know which number course this is. I'm in the CCS program, which I love. Already looking at it as I'm getting to the end of it, thinking, what am I going to do now? I love this. It's been a lot of fun.
Great.
So I've taken most of I think I only have one left that I haven't taken so far.
Okay. Great.
The Nietzsche and Dostoevsky class. So I'm trying to finish up all my other requirements. I am really happy to be in this class with someone who's probably older than I am. I think that's the first time.
You're talking about me?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's great. I am a graduated homeschool mom. My youngest is 18. My oldest are in their 30s, and we homeschooled pretty much all the way through. My youngest went to preschool. I mean, my oldest went to preschool and stuff. But so my interest in this all comes from my years of homeschooling, and I loved what you said, Josh, this morning about your parents knowing these things were important, but not really having the experience themselves. And that was exactly my situation. So the joy for me of homeschooling was it was my education. And I, have said before that even though it seemed like I was doing it for my kids, what I've realized is that I was really doing it for me, and it's been a huge blessing to be able to kind of piggyback on that experience and now formally study these things. Along the way, we've started co-ops and done classes, so I've had, classroom interaction with a lot of students over classics and love everything about this. I could sit here all day and listen to this stuff because I just love it. So
what are some thoughts you have on?
I think those were the things you wanted
Yeah.
us to cover in our introduction. Was there anything
That's
else?
perfect. No, not at all. So tell us some thoughts that you have on the discussions that we've had about the Iliad in particular. Any comments or questions in particular? We're kind of going around and talking about that now. So now's your chance.
So many. Okay, when you were talking in the beginning about Homer, what came to mind, is Homer really one person, or is Homer a tradition, or, that whole criticism thing?
Yep.
I'm with you. I like the idea of one Homer. And I love the part in the Odyssey where he, it's thought that he's introducing himself, Demodocus, the bard.
Yep.
And I love what he says in there about himself. He says, the gods took away my sight, but they gave me this gift of story, and I wouldn't have had that anyway. So I love that, and I love that tradition.
It's an interesting point you make.
I just choose to believe that Homer is Homer. And
if I can remember this for tomorrow morning, we'll maybe start out with that little passage from the Odyssey. I'll pull that up tonight and I'll bring that in.
Yeah, I think it's in what book is this? It is in book 8.
Cool. All right, I'll bring that in. That is a fun reference, and a lot of scholars do think he's talking about himself there. So
I love that.
Other thoughts or questions or just comments?
The whole simile thing.
Yeah.
I make my students mark all the similes that they find in the Iliad.
Okay.
And we talk about why did they do that. And I realize as a reader, as I'm reading those, a lot of times those similes give me relief from the battle. The battle is so hard to read, and especially as a woman, I really don't like reading the battle parts. I have 5 sons. So I have a perspective on that. But it lifts you out of the battle because most of the similes are quite beautiful and kind of, pastoral or rustic. And
So that's a good, just to kind of recap that, but you know, the gist of that would be one possibility for a simile is to take some of the dreadful attention off of, you know, a spear being forced through the side of a man or something like that. I mean, does that's a pretty compelling thought, I think. I think that that's at least part of it. And they are, as you say, Kathy, they are quite beautiful. Many of them are gripping. There's a simile in Homer that's found in the Odyssey that I've always used as the exemplar simile of Homer, but we didn't include the Odyssey, which was my fault, but just an issue of time and space. But I've always used it for high school students because there's a discussion in the Odyssey, and you guys will know the story where Odysseus gets trapped in the cave with Polyphemus, the Cyclops, who has one eye, and Odysseus and his men fashion this spear out of essentially what is like a giant mast, you know, and they harden it, they harden the end of it into a point, and then when it is fire hot, they pierce it into the Cyclops' eye. And the simile there is that the noise that the eye made was the sound of an ironsmith who has heated his metal blade and then put the hot blade into water. It's that, you know, that really, really, and so I always use that with high school, you know, students, and they'll all go around and make the hissing noise, and you know, it's gripping, it's beautiful, but it does distract you from the gore of, you know, this mask being, you know, jammed into a giant's eye to some extent. It amplifies it, but also takes your attention away from the blood and guts. That's a really good, helpful thought. Other thoughts on any of the things we were discussing here, Kathy?
When you were reading the passage, Priam, going
Yes.
to Hector,
Uh-huh.
and his plea,
Mm-hmm.
it just struck me how that is really an echo of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's this father who has this great love for this son, and you know, obviously, like a lot of the echoes, they're distorted and they're not exactly, but it's just it's something we can understand about how a father loves his son, and it just brought up in my mind.
So talking about Priam going to Achilles in this sense that this is like in some sense a gospel type gesture of a glorious king lowering himself. I think that's a really good point. I think you can see an interesting analog or echo. I try to avoid making these kind of things ironclad, but I think you can see an interesting echo in Paul's letter of Philemon, the letter to Philemon. You know, where Paul, as you'll know, is appealing to this wealthy man who has owned a slave who's run away, and Paul addresses him and talks about himself being Paul, an old man and in chains. I mean, perhaps Paul doesn't have Priam in his mind, but it is a similar style of appeal. It's appealing to the honor of someone. Paul later says in that letter, I won't remind you that you owe me your own self. You know, he gets that in too. But there's that lowering where Paul is saying, I could command you this, but I am an old man, I am in chains, and I'm asking. And there's really just a motive appeal in that is very gripping. And I think we see it in Achilles' response, you know, the fact that his wrath is abated. Let's go to other people, just not just, because I think that segues us nicely into not just thoughts and reactions to the Iliad, like what is going on in the Iliad, but how do we approach the Iliad as Christians? I mean, what do you learn from that? Are there things you can use when you preach or teach? Are there things that are helpful to you that we've talked about? What do you think? I mean, now you've got a great sermon on Philemon. Sam, I think I'm going to go first.
I was going to say just trying to look at our desire for life and and how death is a problem. And we all want immortality, and we long for it. They long for it either in their children to live on after them, and that is so hurtful when your child dies, because that's part of you dying, or your fame and your body being desecrated, you know. That's very harmful. In the gospel we see a resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
We see that there is life after death, and I think that's one of the main worries humanity has in general, and that's something that the gospel pretty much answers and addresses.
Homer has this phrase in the Iliad where he talks about death and death's brothers sleep. Okay, so death and sleep for the Greek are brothers. They're gods, minor gods. And so there's a sense in which for a Greek, every time you sleep, you are mimicking the last sleep, the ultimate sleep, right? These are brothers. They work together. And, you know, for the Greek, the ultimate enemy is death. And I think that is different as a Christian, isn't it? I mean, there's a different kind of answer to the question of immortality than simply, well, do a lot of great deeds and maybe you'll be remembered. There is immortality that comes from that. We're sitting here 2,700 years later reading about some of these people. I mean, there is a type of immortality. It's a different type of immortality, right? Did you want to say something on that too?
Not in those lines, but I do like that thought. I was going to say that I think what you see is like this progression of Achilles. You know, it starts off with his rage.
Yeah.
And it really does end with this rage. In a sense, it'll end with this rage of this climactic rage of him dragging this body. But you kind of see this coming, and even when it gets there, like he is, in some ways, you might stooping so low to do this.
Yeah.
And you see how sin can grip a hold of somebody.
Yeah.
At the same time, that's not the end for him. There's that moment when the king comes and removes that, and he basically breaks him down at that point. And so that, I think you can, I don't know exactly how you turn that into a lesson, but I think you can see just how even sin can grip somebody, but it also can be banished with magnificent gesture.
Well, and you have 24 books. Conventionally,
Yeah.
we don't know when this is divided into 24 books, but the very first book, in the very opening line, talks about the rage of Achilles. And we said that kind of sets the tone for the whole book. There's a sense in which the rage of Achilles through the Iliad is building and building and building and building, isn't it? I mean, each new event causes him to be more filled with rage. And then that just turns in a moment. I mean, the appeal of this broken old man just takes all of the rage out of him, or almost all of it, in a moment. And that's just a really beautiful literary device, but it's also a lesson for us. I mean, when we think about the sinfulness of the rage that is building up in him, and also how that is actually removed. It isn't removed by somebody saying, "You're bad, Achilles." It's through the image of someone lowering himself, giving up his own pride, and making this appeal. I think that's pretty powerful. Yeah.
I think there's also like an insatisfaction with the divine picture here. So I think it's like in book 4 when the gods kind of united. They're like, yeah, let's send this archer to strike Menelaus. That will eventually start the war. And then just like how they kind of treat one another, like, and how fickle they are, right?
In terms of the divine council here, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like Zeus is like, I think hitting the ships of the Greeks, and then he gets seduced by Hera, and it's like they
come across as petty.
And it's like we I think honor, we kind of like think of the humans in the story as more heroic in some senses than the divine. So that I think that insatisfaction can point to a I guess flawed system.
It makes you wonder, you know, could you not imagine something better than this kind of deity? You know, is
this
best
kind of what?
Deity, like this kind of God, you know? Can't you imagine a better God than just you, but a little bit more powerful and maybe even more fickle, you know? And again, this is the kind of thing that Christian apologists are always bringing up in the first couple centuries of the church, saying this can't be as good as it gets. You know, there has to be something better than that. What do you think? Did you want to come in on that, Kathy?
No, I just agree.
Yeah. Other thoughts? How we approach this as Christians? I mean, what do you do with this? That's kind of the question. What do you take this and do? I love. I probably shouldn't make this comment, but we have people talking very loudly, right on top of a sign that says "Quiet, please." It's almost like it encourages them to talk loudly. take the sign out, and then everyone will be quiet. What else? What else can you do with this? Yeah.
I hope that you can do something with this.
I do too.
In a way, it seems like both sides are justified with Achilles. I mean, you kind of feel bad for him because he seems to have been wronged. And as well with Hector.
Yep.
I mean, you feel bad for him as well. And what is that? There might be a quote. You know, I don't know. Subjects where good men disagree are the best subjects. And here you have a battle where two good people are really fighting, and they're not just fighting in some debate forum, but they're actually putting their lives on the line, and they have kind of a good cause. And we see how complex the world is, and how big of a problem evil is, and how there's truth to really both sides. And I guess the thing you can do with that is just realize life's a hard place. I mean, there are really difficult, good people do disagree. Yeah. There are hard subjects in the world that we don't really know.
Yeah, and generations of readers of Homer have remarked that one of the things that's interesting is that you have an epic written in Greek by this person who may have been Homer, I think probably was Homer, or at least recorded for us in some form of Greek, about the Greeks' enemies, that put a lot of the Greeks' enemies in a pretty good light. Hector comes across pretty well, doesn't he? I think he does. Priam is a very pitiable kind of character. Achilles may be a very warlike hero that you can model yourself on, but Hector is also very much an emblematic kind of character that you would look at and say to your son, go be like that. So there's this long tradition of hundreds of years of Greek fathers, let's say, teaching their sons to be like one of the Greeks' greatest enemies. You know, there's a complexity to that that's quite beautiful. There's a complexity to that is also kind of at the heart of what we're doing here, reading a pagan text, right, as Christians. I mean, Homer is not writing with a Christian perspective by any means. This is not a Christian story, and yet we can find truth in it. And I think that's significant. Yeah.
Well, I think too, as you talk about Christian aspects of this, I think it's a great picture of the effects of your sin on other people.
Oh yeah.
And so obviously you have Paris and Helen, and that's how this all started. But they started it, but we look at the amount of people and lives that were ruined because of their personal decision to be together, whether it was by choice or by force, of how they ended up together. We're watching a lot of people die somewhat senselessly over their personal decision and selfishness.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. Paris is the ultimate infidelity cautionary tale, right? I mean, this is the face that launched 1,000 ships. Helen, when she's taken to Troy, I mean, this is a world war of sorts that comes about as a result of it. And so you could read it that way. The Iliad is the Bible of the Greeks. That just has to be said. I mean, when the Christians begin formalizing the canon, I mean, the alternate canon for a Greek-speaking person would be Homer. If you read the authoritative texts in the Greek tradition, or if you're a Roman reading them either in Greek or in Latin, you're reading Homer. And you are endlessly debating each story. They're allegorizing it. It's fascinating. Greeks, by the early Christian, Greek scholarship, and done by Greeks and Romans in the early Christian period, often involves trying to get around Homer's or Zeus's bad behavior. You know, so he comes down and impregnates a woman, but then that's actually just an allegory for the Logos, reason, coming down to earth. And you know, they're trying to allegorize it in ways that they get around the hard stuff, the problematic bits. But it has to be said that Homer and the Iliad in particular is really the Bible of the Greeks. I mean, this is their authoritative text. Augustine, interestingly, just as a quick aside, didn't particularly care for it. He liked the book we're going to read tomorrow, the Aeneid. He said he sympathizes with Dido. He got pulled into her sorrow, but Greek was hard for him, especially as a young man. He got beaten in school when he was reading these things, and he couldn't understand why his parents wouldn't take his side. He would go home and tell his parents that they were beating him when he was learning his languages, and his parents laughed at him, which even into middle age he had trouble with.
Now, who you're talking
I'm talking about Augustine. Augustine. Saint Augustine.
Okay.
But he didn't particularly care for the Iliad, from what we can tell. So, other thoughts, Kathy, or anyone here? Did you have anything else you wanted to share on any of that, Kathy?
Yeah, I'm just thinking as I'm listening to you talk about this, it's almost like Homer put Hector and Priam. They're not Greek heroes. The Greek heroes are the ones with the honor, the Kleos, the Achilles. I mean, he's the Greek hero. But Hector and Priam are much more like what we would call Christian heroes.
Mm-hmm.
They're defending their home. They're defending. He's Hector, like you said. He's a surprising. Homer's a Greek. He puts this Trojan hero in there.
Yeah.
It's hard to read Hector any other way than as a hero.
Yeah.
And at the very end, right before the part you read, there's the laments for Hector, and one of the laments is by Helen.
Mm-hmm.
And her lament is just about how incredibly kind Hector always was to her, and how incredibly kind Priam always was to her. And again, just that echo of Scripture, the kind father, the kind son, fighting, even though she says, I did not deserve this. This was wrong. But, whether she's saying she was wrong or she was wrongly taken, you can debate, but anyway,
that's
that just really occurred to me as you were talking about that, just how that's another echo I think we hear. It's that crying out for Christ, something that only Christ could answer.
Yeah, the heroism of Hector and also Priam is a more Christian style heroism. I think that's a very fair thing to say. For the most part, the Christian tradition hasn't really picked up Achilles as kind of the model for the Christian hero. Milton, very famously, who writes the epic Paradise Lost, models his Satan after Achilles. Okay, so we won't read Paradise Lost in this class, but if you ever get a chance to, you'll see that the Satan of Milton is very much like Achilles. The Satan who says it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, right? He's like Achilles. He's full of rage. He's full of wrath. The Christian tradition will see that kind of wrathful, rage-filled man as an antithesis to what a Christian hero looks like. And I think there's some meaning to that we could probably unpack more. Any other thoughts? We're kind of coming to an end. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we'll do tomorrow in a minute, but I want to make sure everyone's gotten a chance to talk if they want to on any of this. Do you have something else, Jim?
I keep going back to the contrast between this epic as an older scenario and the modern, postmodern mentality as such an anti-scenario to that older. And I can't help but think about Camus, who is an atheist, doesn't believe in God, and so doesn't have any of this higher value that is at the root, it seems to me, of epic. And so it's completely void of anything like that, and yet he can't live with that futility. And so the famous line that the ultimate decision, you know what I'm going to say, the ultimate decision that one must make is whether or not to commit suicide.
Right.
So if he really is in a feudalistic scenario, then the logical thing to do would be to commit suicide. And he concludes that that is not the case, but where does he find his his purpose for life? And so he finds it in essentially the ultimate humanism, it seems to me, because the thing that makes life worthwhile is, in the final analysis, you know, being on the beach and having the sunshine. In other words, in a very a very humanistic way of actually living life to its fullest in an empirical way, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the things that you're bringing up in terms of like kind of mid to late 20th century philosophical reflections can only really take place in a context where there's a great deal of wealth and luxury, ultimately. Because I think what you find in and I'm not caricaturing all of it, but a lot of it is the product of a great deal of privilege, where when you're in a war or a battle, you don't have time for all the abstractions. And I think you're seeing that with a lot of the characters in the Iliad. They're not really thinking, well, what if, and what about, right? It's literally like you got to strap on your armor and you go into battle and you spear the other guy or he spears you. Full stop. And that is often true in epic. Epic often is fairly terse when it comes to the philosophy. Much of the early scriptural narrative has kind of an epic feel to it as well. God told Abraham to do such and such. Abraham went and did as the Lord had commanded. I mean, there isn't this like, and then Abraham stepped off to the side and pondered, and you have this like big, bubble of philosophical contemplation. It's just not there. These people are doers. They act, and you see this as kind of rigorous action-based drama. Often when you're looking at an epic, this would be true with a number of the other epics that we encounter. So let me bring our discussion of the new material to an end there, unless there's anybody who wants to get one final comment in. I'm giving you a chance, Kathy, as well as everybody else, if you want one more bite at the apple for today. All right. Hearing nothing, he boldly strode into the darkness. Let's conclude just briefly mentioning what we're going to be addressing tomorrow. So tomorrow when we come in here, we'll start at 9, as I said, and what we will be picking up with will be the Aeneid. Okay, you need to understand that in the interim, there was an Odyssey. Okay, so Homer wrote not only this story, the Iliad, about the fall of Troy, but he wrote a story about one of the Greek heroes, Odysseus, a man of many ways, a crafty man, who, after spending 10 years of his life battling against the Trojans, and eventually being successful, because it's Odysseus who suggests the Trojan horse, seeks to go home to his home of Ithaca, his oikos in Greek. It's kind of like his homey home, it's not just the house, it's the place he lives. And he spends 10 years on that journey. Okay? We don't read that epic in this class. You need to be aware of it. You are very welcome to go out and read it yourself. But right now, this is not included in the class. What is included is the Roman rewriting of the Odyssey and the Roman rewriting of the Iliad. It's a book called the Aeneid. And we'll pick up with that tomorrow morning. It is a book that was written by a Roman poet named Virgil, a wonderful poet who wrote a founding story about the origins of Rome that was kind of built on the back of these Greek epics. So the Romans are looking at the Greeks and saying, well, they think they're special. They've got these founding myths. Where's ours? And Virgil is stepping into the gap and offering them that. So when we come here, hopefully you'll have read the suggested or the assigned passages in the Aeneid, and we'll pick up with that in the morning. Any final thoughts? Everybody know where they're going? All right. Cool. So we're done for today. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
I'll see you tomorrow at 9. Thank you, all of you, for your diligence in the class and your active engagement. It makes it really fun to teach it. So I hope you all are having a good time, at least as good a time as I'm having. You don't have the lights in your face, so.